Chapter 21 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 21. 2 months pass. Unwilling to give up prosecuting the Vrain case while the slightest hope remained of solving its mystery, Lucian sought out Link, the detective, and detailed all the evidence he had collected since the constituted authorities had abandoned the matter. Although Mrs. Vrain and Ferruci had exculpated themselves entirely, Denzil thought that Link, with his professional distrust and trained sense of ferreting out secrets, might discern better than himself whether such exculpations were warranted by circumstances. Link heard all that Denzil had to tell him with outward indifference and inward surprise, for while unwilling, through jealousy of an amateur, to flatter the barrister by a visible compliment, yet he silently admitted that Denzil had made his discoveries and profited by them with much acuteness. What annoyed him, however, was that the young man had pushed his inquiries to the utmost limit, and that there was no chance of any glory accruing to himself by prosecuting them further. Still, on the possibility that something might come of it, he went over the ground already traversed by the amateur detective. "You should have told me of your intentions when Miss Vrain spoke to you in the first instance," he said to Lucian by way of rebuke. "As it is, you have confused the clues so much that I do not know which one to take." "It seems to me that I have pursued each clue till fate or circumstance clipped it short," retorted Lucian, nettled by this injustice. "Mrs. Vrain has defended herself successfully, much in the same way as Count Ferruci has done. Your only chance of getting at the truth lies in discovering Wrent, and unless Rhoda helps you there, I do not see how you can trace the man." "I am of a different opinion," said Link, lying freely to conceal his doubts of success in the matter. "As you have failed through lack of experience, I shall attempt to unravel this skein." "You attempted to do so before, and gave it up because of the tangle," said Lucian with quiet irony. "And unless you discover more than I have done, you will dismiss the matter again as impossible. So far as I can see, the mystery of Vrain's death is more of a mystery than ever, and will never be solved." "I'll make one last attempt to unriddle it, however," answered Link, with a confidence he was far from feeling. "But, of course, not being one of your impossible detectives of fiction, I may fail." "You are certain to fail," said Lucian decisively, and with this disheartening prophecy he left Link to his task of, apparently, spinning ropes of sand. Whether it was that Link was so doubtful of the result as to extend little energy in the search, or whether he really found the task impossible of accomplishment, it is difficult to say. But assuredly he failed as completely as Lucian predicted. With outward zeal he set to work, interviewed Lydia and the Italian to make certain that their defense was genuine, examined the Pagall family, who were dreadfully alarmed by their respectability being intruded upon by a common detective, and obtained a fresh denial from Baxter & Company's saleswoman that Ferruci was the purchaser of the cloak. Also he cross-questioned Mrs. Bensusan and her sharp handmaid in the most exhaustive manner, and did his best to trace out the mysterious Wrent who had so much to do with the matter. He even called on Dr. Jorce at Hampstead to satisfy himself as to the actual time of Ferruci's arrival in that neighborhood on Christmas Eve. But here he received a check, for Jorce had gone abroad on his annual holiday and was not expected back for a month. In fact, Link did all that a man could do to arrive at the truth, only to find himself at the end of his labors in the same position as Lucian had been. Disgusted at this result, he threw up his brief and called upon Diana and Denzil, with whom he had previously made an appointment, to notify them of his inability to bring the matter to a satisfactory conclusion. "There is not the slightest chance of finding the assassin of Mr. Vrain," said Link, after he had set forth at length his late failures. "The more I go into the matter, the more I see it." "Yet you were so confident of doing more than I," said Lucian quietly. Link turned sulkily after the fashion of a bad loser. "I did my best," he retorted gloomily. "No man can do more. Some crimes are beyond the power of the law to punish for sheer lack of proof. This is one of them, and so far as I can see, this unknown assassin will be punished on Judgment Day, not before." "Then you don't think that Signor Ferruci is guilty?" said Diana. "No. He has had nothing to do with the matter, nor has Mrs. Vrain brought about the death in any way." "You cannot say who killed my father?" "Not for certain, but I suspect Wrent." "Then why not find Wrent?" asked Diana bluntly. "He has hidden his trail too well," began Link, and if you did find him," finished Denzil coolly, "he might prove himself guiltless after the fashion of Mrs. Vrain and Ferruci." "He might, sir. There is no knowing. But since you think I have done so little, Mr. Denzil, let me ask you who it is you suspect." "Dr. Jorce of Hampstead." "Pooh, pooh!" cried Link with contempt. "He didn't kill the man. How could he, seeing that he was at Hampstead on that Christmas Eve midnight, as I found out from his servants?" "I don't suspect him of actually striking the blow," replied Lucian, "but I believe he knows who did." "Not he. Dr. Jorce has too responsible a position to mix himself up in a crime from which he gains no benefit." "Why, what position does he hold?" "He is the owner of a private lunatic asylum. Is it likely that a man like him would commit a murder?" "Again, I deny that he did commit the crime, but I am certain from the very fact of his friendship with Ferruci that he knows more than he chooses to tell. Why should the Italian be intimate with the owner of a private asylum, with a man so much beneath him in rank?" "I don't know, sir. But if you suspect Dr. Jorce, you had better see him when he comes back from his holidays, in a month." "Where is he now?" "In Italy, and the Count has gone with him." Diana and Lucian looked at one another, and the former spoke. "That is strange," she said. "I agree with Mr. Denzil. It is peculiar, to say the least of it, that an Italian noble should make a bosom friend of a man so far inferior to him in position. Don't you think so yourself, Mr. Link?" "Madam," said Link gravely, "I think nothing about it, save that you will never find out the truth. I have tried my best and failed, and I am confident enough in my own power to say that where I have failed no one else will succeed. Miss Vrain, Mr. Denzil, I wish you good day." And with this bragging speech, which revealed the hurt vanity of the man, Mr. Link took his departure. Lucian held his peace, for in the face of this desertion of a powerful ally he did not know what to say. Diana walked to the sitting-room window and watched Link disappear into the crowd of passers-by. At that she heaved a sigh, for with him, she thought, went every chance of learning the truth, since if he, an experienced person in such matters, turned back from the quest, there could assuredly be no help in anyone not professional and with less trained abilities. Then she turned to Lucian. "There's nothing more to be done, I suppose," said she, sighing again. "I am afraid not," replied Lucian dismally, for he was quite of her opinion regarding the desertion of the detective. "Then I must leave this unknown assassin to the punishment of God," said Diana quietly, "and I can only thank you for all you have done for me, Mr. Denzil, and say—" She hesitated and blushed, then added with some emphasis, "say au revoir." "Ah!" ejaculated Denzil with an indrawn breath of relief. I am glad you did not say good-bye." "I don't wish to say it, Mr. Denzil. I have not so many friends in the world that I can afford to lose so good a one as yourself." "I am content," said Lucian softly, "that you should think of me as your friend for the present." His meaning was so unmistakable that Diana, still blushing and somewhat confused, hastened to prevent his saying more at so awkward a moment. "Then, as my friend, I hope you will come and see me at Berwin Manor." "I shall be delighted. When do you go down?" "Within a fortnight. I must remain that time in town to see my lawyer about the estate left by my poor father." "And see Mrs. Vrain?" "No," replied Diana coldly. "Now that my father is dead, Mrs. Vrain is nothing to me. Indirectly, I look upon her as the cause of his death, for if she had not driven both of us out of our own home, my father might have been alive still. I shall not call on Mrs. Vrain, and I do not think she will dare to call on me." "I'm not so sure of that," rejoined Lucian, who was well acquainted with the lengths to which Mrs. Vrain's audacity would carry her. "But let us dismiss her, with all your other troubles. May I call on you again before you leave town?" "Occasionally," replied Diana, smiling and blushing. "And you will come down to Berwin Manor when I send you an invitation?" "I should think so," said Denzil in high glee, as he rose to depart. "And now I will say good-bye?" said Miss Vrain, holding out her hand. "No, I will use your own form of farewell. Au revoir." Then Lucian went out from the presence of his beloved, exulting that she had proved so kind as not to dismiss him when she no longer required his services. In another woman he would not have minded such ingratitude, but had Diana banished him thus, he would have been miserable beyond words. Also, as Lucian joyfully reflected, her invitation to Berwin Manor showed that, far from wishing to lose sight of him, she desired to draw him into yet closer intimacy. There could be nothing but good resulting from her invitation and his acceptance, and already Denzil looked forward to some bright summer's day in the green and leafy country when he should ask this goddess among women to be his wife. If encouragement and looks and blushes went for anything, he hardly doubted the happy result. In the meantime, while Lucian dreamed his dreams, Diana, also dreaming in her own way, remained in town and attended to business. She saw her lawyers and had her affairs looked into, so that when she went to Bath she was legally installed as the mistress of Berwin Manor and its surrounding acres. As Lucian hinted, Lydia did indeed try to see her stepdaughter. She called twice, and was refused admission into Diana's presence. She wrote 3 times, and received no reply to her letters. So the consequence was that, finding Diana declined to have anything to do with her in any way whatsoever, she became very bitter. This feeling she expressed to Lucian, whom she one day met in Piccadilly. "As if I had done anything," finished Lydia, after a recital of all her grievances. "I call it real mean. Don't you think so, Mr. Denzil?" "If you ask me, Mrs. Vrain," said Lucian stiffly, "I think you and Miss Vrain are better apart." "Of course you defend her, but I guess I can't blame you, as I know what you're driving at." "What about Signor Ferruci?" asked Denzil, parrying. "Oh, we are good friends still, but nothing more. As he proved that he did not kill Mark, I have no reason to give him his walking ticket. But," added Mrs. Vrain dryly, "I guess you'll be married to Diana before I hitch up 'longside Ercole." "How do you know I shall marry Miss Vrain?" asked Lucian, flushing. "If you saw your face in a glass you wouldn't ask, I guess. Tomatoes ain't in it for redness. I won't dance at your wedding, and I won't break my heart either." And with a gay nod, Mrs. Lydia Vrain tripped away, evidently quite forgetful of the late tragedy in her life. Chapter 22 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 22. At Berwin Manor. The heritage of Diana lay some miles from Bath, in a pleasant wooded valley, through which meandered a placid and slow-flowing stream. On either side of this water stretched broad meadow-lands, flat and fertile as well they might be, seeing they were of rich black loam, and well drained withal. To the right these meadows were bounded by forest lands, the trees of which grew thickly up and over the ridge, and on the space where wood met fields was placed the manor, a quaint square building of Georgian architecture, and some 2 centuries old. Against the green of the trees, its warm walls of red brick and sloping roof of bluish slate made a pleasant spot of color. There stretched a terrace before it. Beneath the terrace a flower garden and orchard, and below these the meadowlands, white with snow in winter, black in spring with ridgy furrows, and golden with grain in the hot days of summer. Altogether a lovely and peaceful spot, where a man could pass pleasant days in rural quiet, a hermitage of rest for the life-worn and heart-weary. Here, towards the end of summer, came Lucian, to rest his brain after the turmoil of London, and to court his mistress under the most favourable circumstances. Diana had established herself in her ancestral home, with a superannuated governess as a chaperon, for without such a guardianship she could hardly have invited the barrister to visit her. Miss Priscilla Barber was a placid, silver-haired old dame, who, having taught Diana for many years, had returned, now that the American Mrs. Vrain had departed, to spend the rest of her days under the roof of her dear pupil. She took a great fancy to Lucian, which was just as well, seeing what was the object of his visit, and complacently watched the growing attachment between the handsome young couple, who seemed so suited to one another. But her duties as chaperon were nominal, for when not pottering about the garden she was knitting in a snug corner, and when knitting failed to interest her she slumbered quietly, in defiance of the etiquette which should have compelled her to make a third in the conversation of her young friends. As for Lucian and his charming hostess, they found that they had so many tastes in common, and enjoyed each other's society so much, that they were hardly ever apart. Diana saw with the keen eyes of a woman that Lucian was in love with her, and let it be seen in a marvellously short space of time, and without much difficulty that she was in love with him. But even after Lucian had been at the manor a fortnight, and daily in the society of Diana, he spoke no word of love. Seeing how beautiful she was, and how dowered with lands and rents and horses, he began to ask himself whether it was not rather a presumption on his part to ask her to share his life. He had only 300 a year, £6 a week, and a profession in which, as yet, he had not succeeded. So he could offer her very little in exchange for her beauty, wealth, and position. The poor lover became quite pale with fruitless longing, and his spirits fell so low that good Miss Priscilla one day drew him aside to ask about his health. "For," said she, "if you are ill in body, Mr. Denzil, I know of some remedies, old woman's medicines you will call them, no doubt, which, with the blessing of God, may do you good." "Thank you, Miss Barber, but I am not ill in body, worse luck," and Lucian sighed. "Why worse luck, Mr. Denzil?" said the old lady severely. "That is an ungrateful speech to Providence." "I would rather be ill in body than ill in mind," explained Denzil, blushing, for in some ways he was younger than his years. "And are you ill in mind?" asked Miss Priscilla, with a twinkle in her eyes. "Alas, yes." "Can you cure me?" "No. For that cure I shall hand you over to Diana." "Miss Priscilla!" and Lucian coloured again, this time with vexation. "Oh, Mr. Denzil," laughed the governess, Because I am old, you must not imagine that I am blind. I see that you love Diana." "Better than my life," cried the devoted lover with much fervor. "Of course, that is the usual romantic answer to make. Well, why do you not tell Diana so, with any pretty additions your fancy suggests?" "She might not listen to me," said this doubting lover dolefully. "Very true," replied his consoler. "On the other hand, she might. Besides, Mr. Denzil, however much the world may have altered since my youth, I have yet to learn that it is the lady's part to propose to the gentleman." "But, Miss Barber, I am poor." "What of that? Diana is rich." "Don't I know it? For that very reason I hesitate to ask her." "Because you are afraid of being called a fortune hunter, I suppose," said the old lady dryly. "That shows a lack of moral courage which is not worthy of you, Mr. Denzil. Take an old woman's advice, young man, and put your fortunes to the test. Remember Montrose's advice in the song." "You approve of my marrying Diana? I mean Miss Vrain?" "From what I have seen of you, and from what Diana has told me about you, I could wish her no better husband. Poor girl, after the tragical death of her father and her wretched life with that American woman, she deserves a happy future." "And do you really think that she would be happy with me?" stammered Lucian, hardly daring to believe Miss Priscilla, whose acquaintance with him seemed too recent to warrant such trust. The wise old woman laughed and nodded. "Ask her yourself, my dear," she said, patting his hand. "She will be able to answer that question better than I. Besides, girls like to say yea or nay themselves." This seemed to be good advice, and certainly none could have been more grateful to the timid lover. That very night he made up his mind to risk his fortunes by speaking to Diana. It was no easy matter for this young man to bring himself to do so, for cool, bold, and fluent as he was on ordinary occasions, the fever of love rendered him shy and nervous. The looks of Diana acted on his spirits as the weather does on a barometer. A smile made him jocund and hilarious, a frown abashed him almost to gloom, and in the April weather of her presence he was as variable as a weathercock. It is, therefore, little to be wondered at that one ordinarily daring should tremble to ask a question which might be answered in the negative. True, Miss Barber's partisanship heartened him a trifle, but he still feared for the result. Cupid, as well as conscience, makes cowards of us all, and Lucian was a doubting lover. Towards the end of his stay, Miss Priscilla, as usual, fell asleep one evening after dinner, and Diana, feeling the house too warm, stepped out into the garden, followed by Lucian. The sun had just set behind the undulating hills, and the clear sky, to the zenith, was of a pale rose colour, striped toward the western horizon with lines of golden cloud. In the east a cold blue prevailed, and here and there a star sparkled in the arch of the sky. The garden was filled with floating shadows, which seemed to glide into it from the dark recesses of the near woods, and in a copse some distance away a nightingale was singing to his mate, and filling the silence with melody. The notes fluted sweetly through the still air, mingling with the sigh of the rising wind and the musical splashing of the fountain. This shot up a pillar of silvery water to a great height, and in descending sprinkled the near flower beds with its cold spray. All was inexpressibly beautiful to the eye and soothing to the ear, a scene and an hour for love. It might have been the garden of the Capulets, and those who moved in it, the immortal lovers, as yet uncursed by fate. "Only 3 more days," sighed Lucian, as he walked slowly down the path beside Diana, "and then that noisy London again." "Perhaps it is as well," said Diana in her practical way. "You would rust here. But is there any need for you to go back so soon?" "I must, for my own peace of mind." Diana started and blushed at the meaning of his tone and words. Then she recovered her serenity and sat down on an old stone seat, near which stood a weather-beaten statue of Venus. Seeing that she kept silent in spite of his broad hint, Lucian, to bring matters to a crisis, resolved to approach the subject in a mythological way through the image of the goddess. "I am sorry I am not a Greek, Miss Vrain," he said abruptly. "Why?" asked Diana, secretly astonished by the irrelevancy of the remark. Lucian plucked a red rose from the bush which grew near the statue and placed it on the pedestal. "Because I would lay my offering at the feet of the goddess and touch her knees to demand a boon." "What boon would you ask?" said Diana in a low voice. "I would beseech that in return for my rose of flowers she would give me the rose of womanhood." "A modest request. Do you think it would be granted?" "Do you?" asked Lucian, picking up the rose again. "How can I reply to your parables, or read your dark sayings?" said Diana, half in earnest, half in mirth. "I can speak plainer if you permit it." If you like." The young man laid the rose on Diana's lap. "Then in return for my rose, give me yourself." "Mr. Denzil!" cried Diana, starting up, whereby the flower fell to the ground. You surprise me." "Indeed, I surprise myself," said Lucian sadly. "That I should dare to raise my eyes to you is no doubt surprising." "I don't see that at all," exclaimed Diana coldly. "I like to be wooed like a woman, not honored like a goddess." "You are both woman and goddess. But you are not angry?" "Why should I be angry?" "Because I love you. I cannot be angry with, shall we say, a compliment." "Oh, Diana!" "Wait, wait!" cried Miss Vrain, waving back this too eager lover. "You cannot love me. You have known me only a month or two." "Love can be born in an hour," cried Lucian eagerly. "I loved you on the first day I saw you. I love you now. I shall love you ever." "Will you truly love me ever, Lucian?" "Oh, my darling, can you doubt it? And you?" He looked at her hopefully. "And I?" she repeated in a pretty mocking tone. "And I?" With a laugh she bent and picked up the flower. "I take the rose, and I give you—" "Yourself!" cried the enraptured lover, and the next moment he was clasping her to his breast. "Oh, Diana, dearest, will you really be my wife?" "Yes," she said softly, and kissed him. For a few moments the emotions of both overcame them too much to permit further speech. Then Diana sat down and made Lucian sit beside her. "Lucian," she said in a firm voice, "I love you, and I shall be your wife when you find out who killed my poor father." "It is impossible!" he cried in dismay. "No, we must prosecute the search. I have no right to be happy while the wretch who killed him is still at large. We have failed hitherto, but we may succeed yet, and when we succeed I shall marry you." "My darling!" cried Lucian in ecstasy. And then, in a more subdued tone, "I'll do all I can to find out the truth. But, after all, from what point can I begin afresh?" "From the point of Mrs. Vrain," said Diana unexpectedly. "Mrs. Vrain?" cried the startled Lucian. "Do you still suspect her?" "Yes, I do. But she has cleared herself on the most undeniable evidence." "Not in my eyes," said Diana obstinately. "If Mrs. Vrain is innocent, how did she find out that the unknown man murdered in Geneva Square was my father?" By his assumption of the name of Berwin, which was mentioned in the advertisement. Also from the description of the body, and particularly by the mention of the cicatrice on the right cheek, and of the loss of the little finger on the left hand." Diana started. "I never heard that about the little finger," she said hurriedly. "Are you sure?" "Yes. I saw myself, when I knew your father as Berwin, that he had lost that little finger." "Then, Lucian, you did not see my father." "What?" cried Denzil, hardly able to credit her words. "My father never lost a finger," cried Diana, starting to her feet. "Ah, Lucian, I now begin to see light. That man who called himself Berwin, who was murdered, was not my father. No, I believe, on my soul, I believe that my father, Mark Vrain, is alive." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 23. A Startling Theory. When Diana declared that her father yet lived, Lucian drew back from her in amazement, for of all impossible things said of this impossible case, this saying of hers was the strangest and most incredible. Hitherto not a suspicion had entered his mind but that the man so mysteriously slain in Geneva Square was Mark Vrain, and for the moment he thought that Diana was distraught to deny so positive a fact. "It is impossible," said he, shaking his head. "Quite impossible. Mrs. Vrain identified the corpse, and so did other people who knew your father well." "As to Mrs. Vrain," said Diana contemptuously, "I quite believe she would lie to gain her own ends. And it may be that the man who was murdered was like my father in the face, but—" "He had the mark on his cheek," interrupted Lucian, impatient of this obstinate belief in the criminality of Lydia. "I know that mark well," replied Miss Vrain. "My father received it in a duel he fought in his youth, when he was a student in a German university. But the missing finger?" She shook her head. "He might have lost the finger while you were in Australia," suggested the barrister. "He might," rejoined Diana doubtfully, "but it is unlikely. As to other people identifying the body, they no doubt did so by looking at the face and its scar. Still, I do not believe the murdered man was my father." "If not, why should Mrs. Vrain identify the body as that of her husband?" "Why? Because she wanted to get the assurance money. She may have been misled by the resemblance of the dead man to your father. And who provided that resemblance? My dear Lucian, I would not be at all surprised to learn that there was conspiracy as well as murder in this matter. My father left his home, and Lydia could not find him. I quite believe that. As she cannot prove his death, she finds it impossible to obtain the assurance money, so what does she do?" "I cannot guess," said Lucian, anxious to hear Diana's theory. "Why, she finds a man who resembles my father, and sets him to play the part of the recluse in Geneva Square. She selects a man in ill health and given to drink, that he may die the sooner, and by being buried as Mark Vrain, give her the money she wants. When you told me of this man Berwin's coughing and drinking, I thought it strange, as my father had no consumptive disease when I left him, and never during his life was he given to overindulgence in drink. Now I see the truth. This dead man was Lydia's puppet. Even granting that this is so, which I doubt, Diana, why should the man be murdered?" "Why?" cried Diana fiercely, "because he was not dying quickly enough for that woman's purpose. She did not kill him herself, if her alibi is to be credited, but she employed Ferruci to murder him." "You forget Signor Ferruci also proved an alibi." "A very doubtful one," said Miss Vrain scornfully. "You did not ask that Dr. Jorce the questions you should have done. Go up to London now, Lucian, see him at Hampstead, and find out if Ferruci was at his house at 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Then I shall believe him guiltless. Till then I hold him but the creature and tool of Lydia." "Jorce declares that Ferruci was with him at the house when the murder was committed? Can you believe that? Ferruci may have made it worth the while of this doctor to lie. And even granting that much, the presence of Ferruci at the Jersey Street house shows that he knew what was going to take place on that night, and perhaps arranged with another man to do the deed. Either way you look at it, he and Lydia are implicated." "I tell you it is impossible, Diana," said Lucian, finding it vain to combat this persistent belief. "All this plotting of crime is such as is found in novels, not in real life." "In real life," cried Diana, taking the words out of his mouth, "more incredible things take place than can be conceived by the most fantastic imagination of an author. Look at this talk of ours. It began with words of love and marriage speeches, and it ends with a discussion of murder. But this I say, Lucian, that if you love me and would have me marry you, you must find out the truth of these matters. Learn if this dead man is my father, for from what you have told me of the lost finger, I do not believe that he is. Hunt down the assassin, and discover if he is whom I believe him to be, Ferruci himself, and learn, if you can, what Lydia has to do with all these evil matters. Do this, and I am yours. Refuse, and I shall not marry you." "You set me a hard task," said Lucian with a sigh, "and I hardly know how to set about it." "Be guided by me," replied Diana. "Go up to London and put an advertisement in the papers offering a reward for the discovery of my father. He is of medium height, with grey hair, and has a clean shaven face with a scar on it." "You describe the dead man, Diana." "But he has not lost a finger," continued Diana, as though she had not heard him. "If my father, for fear of Lydia, is in hiding, he will come to you or me in answer to that advertisement." "But he must have seen the report of his death by violence in the papers, if indeed he is alive," urged Lucian, at his wits' end. "My father is weak in the head, and perhaps was afraid to come out in the midst of such trouble. But if you put in the advertisement that I, his daughter, am in England, he will come to me, for with me he knows he is safe. Also call on Dr. Jorce and find out the truth about Signor Ferruci. And then, when you have done these two things, we shall see what will come of them. Promise me to do what I ask you." "I promise," said Lucian, taking her hand. "But you send me on a wild goose chase." "That may be, Lucian, but my heart, my presentiment, my instinct, whatever you like to call it, tells me otherwise. Now let us go inside." "Shall we tell Miss Barber of our engagement?" asked Denzil timidly. "No, you will tell no one of that until we learn the truth of this conspiracy. When we do, Lucian, you will find that my father is not dead, but is alive, and will be at our wedding." "I doubt it, I doubt it." "I am sure of it," answered Diana, and slipping her hand within the arm of her lover, she walked with him up to the house. It was the strangest of wooings. Miss Barber, with a true woman's interest in love affairs, was inclined to congratulate them both when they entered, deeming, as the chance had been so propitious, that Lucian had proposed. But Diana looked so stern, and Lucian so gloomy, that she held her peace. Later on, when her curiosity got the better of her desire not to offend her pupil, she asked if Denzil had spoken. "Yes," replied Diana, "he has spoken." "And you have refused him!" cried the old lady in dismay, for she did not relish the idea that Lucian should have lost by her counsel. "No, I have not refused him." "Then you have said yes, my dear." "I have said sufficient," replied Diana cautiously. "Please do not question me any further, Miss Barbar. Lucian and I understand one another very well." "She calls him by his Christian name," thought the wise old dame. "That is well." "She will not speak of her happiness. That is ill." And in various crafty ways Miss Barbar tried to learn how matters actually stood between the pair. But if she was skilful in asking questions, Diana was equally skilful in baffling them, and Miss Barbar learned nothing more than her pupil chose to tell her, and that was little enough. To perplex her still further, Lucian departed for London the next day, with a rather disconsolate look on his handsome face, and gave his adviser no very satisfactory explanation at parting. So Miss Barbar was forced to remain in ignorance of the success or failure of her counsel, and could by no means discover if the marriage she was so anxious to bring about was likely to take place. And so ended Denzil's visit to Berwin Manor. In the meantime, Lucian went back to London with a heavy heart, for he did not see how he was to set about the task imposed on him by Diana. At first he thought it would be best to advertise, as she advised, but this he considered would be no good, as if Vrain, supposing him to be alive and in hiding, would not come out at the false report of his murder, he certainly would not appear in answer to an advertisement that might be a snare. Then Lucian wondered if it would be possible to have the grave opened a second time, that Diana might truly see if the corpse was that of her father or of another man. But this also was impossible, and, to speak plainly, useless, for by this time the body would not be recognizable. Therefore it would be of little use to exhume the poor dead man, whomever he might be, for the second time. Finally, Lucian judged it would be wisest of all to call on Dr. Jorce, and to find out why he was friendly with Ferruci, and how much he knew of the Italian's doings. While the barrister was making up his mind to this course, he was surprised to receive a visit from no less a person than Mr. Jabez Clyne, the father of Lydia. The little man, usually so bright and merry, now looked worried and ill at ease. Lucian, so much as he had seen of him, had always liked him better than Lydia, and was sorry to see him so downcast. Nor, when he learned the reason, was he better pleased. Clyne told it to him in a roundabout way. "Do you know anything against Signor Ferruci?" he asked, when the first greeting was over. "Very little, and that bad," replied Denzil shortly. "Do you refer to the horrible death of my son-in-law?" "Yes, I do, Mr. Clyne. I believe Ferruci had a hand in it, and if you bring him here I'll tell him so." "Can you prove it?" asked Clyne eagerly. "No. As yet Ferruci has proved that he was not in Geneva Square on the night of the crime, or rather," added Lucian, correcting himself, "at the hour when the murder was committed." Clyne's face fell. "I wish you could discover if he was guilty or not," he said. "I'm anxious to know the truth." "Why?" asked Lucian bluntly. "Because, if he is guilty, I don't want my daughter to marry a murderer." "What? Is Mrs. Vrain going to marry him?" "Yes," said the little man disconsolately, "and I wish she wasn't." "So do I, for her own sake. I thought she did not like him. She said as much to me." "I can't make her out, Mr. Denzil. She grew tired of him for a time, but now she's taken up with him again, and nothing I can say or do will stop the marriage. I love Lydia beyond words, as she is my only child, and I don't want to see her married to a man of doubtful reputation like Ferruci. So I thought I'd call and see if you could help me." "I can't," replied Lucian, As yet I have found out nothing likely to implicate Ferruci in the crime." "But you may," said Clyne hopefully. Lucian shrugged his shoulders. "If I do, you shall know at once," he said. Chapter 24
of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 24. Lucian is surprised. Although Denzil received Mr. Clyne with all courtesy, and promised to aid him if he could in breaking off the marriage with Ferruci by revealing his true character to Mrs. Vrain, he by no means made a confidant of the little man, or entrusted him with the secret of his plans. Clyne, as he well knew, was dominated in every way by his astute daughter, and did he learn Lucian's intentions, he was quite capable, through sheer weakness of character, of revealing the same to Lydia, who, in her turn, since she was bent upon marrying Ferruci, might retail them to the Italian, and so put him on his guard. Denzil, therefore, rid himself of the American by promising to tell him, on some future occasion, all that he knew about Ferruci. Satisfied with this, Clyne departed in a more cheerful mood, and apparently hoped for the best. After his departure, Lucian again began to consider his idea of calling on Jorce regarding the alibi of Ferruci. On further reflection he judged that, before paying the visit to Hampstead, it might be judicious to see Rhoda again and refresh his memory in connection with the events of Christmas Eve. With this idea, he put on his hat, and shortly after the departure of Clyne, walked round to George's Street. On ringing the bell, the door was opened by Rhoda in person, looking sharper and more cunning than ever. She informed him that he could not see Mrs. Bensusan, as that good lady was in bed with a cold. "I don't want to see your mistress, my girl," said Lucian quickly, to stop Rhoda from shutting the door in his face, which she seemed disposed to do. "I desire to speak with you." "About that there murder?" asked Rhoda sharply. Then, in reply to the nod of Lucian, she continued, "I told you all I knew about it when you called before. I don't know nothing more. Can you tell me the name of the dark man you saw in the yard?" "No, I can't. I know nothing about him." "Did you ever hear Mr. Wrent mention his name?" "No, sir. He called and he went, and I saw him in the backyard at 8:30. I never spoke to him, and he never spoke to me." "Could you swear to the man if you saw him?" "Yes, I could." "Have you got him with you?" asked Rhoda eagerly. "Not at present," answered Lucian, rather surprised by the vindictive expression on the girl's face. "But later on I may call upon you to identify him." "Do you know who he is?" asked the servant quickly. "I think so." "Did he kill that man?" "Possibly," said Denzil, wondering at these very poetic questions. "Why do you ask?" "I have my reasons, sir. Where's my cloak?" "I will return it later on. It will, probably be used as evidence." Rhoda started. "Where?" she demanded with a frown. "At the trial, do you think they will hang the person who killed Mr. Vrain? If the police catch him, and his guilt is proved, I'm sure they will hang him." The girl's eyes flashed with a wicked light, and she clasped her hands with a quick, nervous movement. "I hope they will," she said in a low, rapid voice. "I hope they will." "What?" cried Lucian with a step forward. "Do you know the assassin?" "No," cried Rhoda with much vehemence. "I swear I don't. But I think the murderer ought to be hanged. I know something. See me tomorrow night and you'll hear." "Hear what?" "The truth," said this strange girl, and shut the door before Lucian could say another word. The barrister, quite dumbfounded, remained on the step looking at the closed door. So important were Rhoda's words that he was on the point of ringing again to interview her once more and force her to speak. But when he reflected that Mrs. Bensusan was in bed, and that Rhoda alone could reopen the door, which, from her late action, it was pretty evident she would not do, he decided to retire for the present. It was little use to call in the police or create trouble by forcing his way into the house, as that might induce Rhoda to run away before giving her evidence. So Lucian departed with the intention of keeping the next night's appointment and hearing what Rhoda had to say. "The truth," he repeated as he walked along the street. "Evidently she knows who killed this man. If so, why did she not speak before? And why is she so vindictive? Heavens! If Diana's belief should be a true one and her father not dead! Conspiracy, murder, this gypsy girl, that subtle Italian, and the mysterious rent. My head is in a whirl. I cannot understand what it all means. Tomorrow, when Rhoda speaks, I may. But can I trust her? I doubt it. Still, there is nothing else for it. I must trust her." Talking to himself in this incoherent way, Lucian reached his rooms and tried to quiet the excitement of his brain caused by the strange words of Rhoda. It was yet early in the afternoon, so he took up a book and threw himself on the sofa to read for an hour. But he found it quite impossible to fix his attention on the page. The case in which he was concerned was far more exciting than any invention of the brain, and after a vain attempt to banish it from his mind, he jumped up and threw the book aside. Although he did not know it, Lucian was suffering from a sharp attack of detective fever, and the only means of curing such a disease is to learn the secret which haunts the imagination. Rhoda, as she stated, rather ambiguously it must be confessed, could reveal this especial secret touching the murder of Vrain, but for some hidden reason chose to delay her confession for 24 hours. Lucian, all on fire with curiosity, found himself unable to bear this suspense. So, to distract his mind and learn, if possible, the true relationship existing between Ferruci and Joss, he set out for Hampstead to interview the doctor. The Haven, as Joss, with some humour, termed his private asylum, was the red brick house, large, handsome and commodious, built in a wooded and secluded part of Hampstead. It was surrounded by a high brick wall, over which the trees of its park could be seen, and possessed a pair of elaborate iron gates, opening onto a quiet country lane. Externally, it looked merely the estate of a gentleman. The grounds were large, and when laid down in flower gardens and orchards, and, as it was Dr. George's system to allow his least crazy patients as much liberty as possible, they roamed at will round the grounds, giving the place a cheerful and populated look. The more violent inmates were, of course, secluded, but these were well and kindly treated by the doctor. Indeed, George was a very human man, and had a theory that more cures of the unhappy beings under his charge could be effected by kindness than by severity. His asylum was more like a private hotel with paying guests than an establishment for the retention of the insane, and even to an outside observer, the eccentricities of the doctor's family, as he loved to call them, were not more marked than many of the oddities possessed by people at large. Indeed, George was in the habit of saying that there were more mad people in the world than were kept under lock and key, and in this he was doubtless right. However, the kindly and judicious little man was like a father to those under his charge, and very popular with them all. Anything more unlike the popular conception of an asylum than the establishment at Hampstead can scarcely be imagined. When Lucian arrived at the Haven, he found that George had long since returned from his holiday, and was that day at home. So, on sending in his card, he was at once admitted into the presence of the local potentate. George, looking smaller and more like a fairy changeling than ever, was evidently pleased to see Lucian, but the look on his dry yellow face indicated that he was somewhat puzzled to account for the visit. However, preliminary greetings having passed, Lucian did not leave him long in doubt. "Dr. George," he said boldly, and without preamble, "I have called to see you about that alibi of Signor Ferruci's." "Alibi is a nasty word, Mr. Denzil," said George, looking sharply at his visitor. "Perhaps, but it is the only word that can be used with propriety." "But I thought that I was called on to decide a bet." "Oh, that was Count Ferruci's clever way of putting it," responded Lucian with a sneer. "He did not wish you to know too much about his business." "Perhaps I know more than you think, Mr. Denzil." "What do you mean, sir?" cried Lucian sharply. "Softly, Mr. Denzil, softly," rejoined the doctor, waving his hand. "I shall explain everything to your satisfaction. Do you know why I went to Italy?" "No, no more than I know why you went with Signor Ferruci," replied Lucian, recalling Link's communication. "Ah," said George placidly, "you have been making inquiries, I see, but you are wrong in one particular. I did not go to Italy with Ferruci. I left him in Paris, and I went on myself to Florence to find out the true character of the man." "Why did you wish to do that, doctor?" because I had some business with our mutual friend the Count, and I was not altogether pleased with the way in which it was conducted. Also, my last interview with you about that bet made me suspicious of the man. Over in Florence, I learned sufficient about the Count to assure me that he is a bad man with whom it is as well to have as little to do as possible. I intended to return at once with this information and call on you, Mr. Denzil. Unfortunately, I fell ill of an attack of typhoid fever in Florence, and had to stay there these 2 months. I'm sorry, said Lucian, noting that the doctor did look ill. But why did you not send on your information to me? It was necessary to see you in person, Mr. Denzil. I arrived back a few days ago, and intended writing to you when I recovered from the fatigue of the journey. However, your arrival saves me the trouble. Now I can tell you all about Ferruci, if you like. Then tell me, doctor, if you spoke truly about that alibi? Yes, I did. Count Ferruci was with me that night, and stayed here until the next morning. What time did he arrive? About 10 o'clock, or, to be precise, said George, about 10:30. Ah, cried Lucian exultantly. Then Ferruci must have been the man in the backyard. What do you mean by that? Asked George in a puzzled tone. Why, that Count Ferruci had to do with the crime committed some months ago in Pimlico. A man called Mark Vrain was murdered, as you may have seen in the papers, doctor, and I believe Ferruci murdered him. If I remember rightly, said George with calmness, the man in question was murdered shortly before midnight on Christmas Eve. If that is so, Ferruci could not have killed him, because, as I said before, he was here at 10:30 on that night. I don't say he actually killed the man, explained Lucian eagerly, but he certainly employed someone to strike the blow. Else, what was he doing in the George's Street yard on that night? You can say what you like, Dr. George, but that man is guilty of Mark Vrain's death. No, replied George coolly, he is not, for the simple reason that Vrain is not dead. Not dead? Repeated Lucian, recalling Diana's belief. No, for the last few months Mark Vrain, under the name of Michael Clare, has been in this asylum. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Entman. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 25. A Dark Plot. So, Vrain is alive after all, was Lucian's comment on the speech of Jorce. And he is under your charge. Jove, it's wonderful. Diana was right after all. Diana? Who is Diana? Queried Jorce, then held up his hand to stop the visitor from replying. Wait, I know. Vrain mentioned his daughter Diana. Yes, she is the daughter of Vrain, and she believes her father to be alive. On what grounds? Because the dead man, whom until recently she believed to be Mr. Vrain, had one of his little fingers missing. That fact came to her knowledge only a week ago, and when it did, she declared that the deceased could not be her father. Said Jorce thoughtfully. I am quite in the dark as to why Mr. Vrain was put under my charge. Because Ferrucci wished to marry his widow. I see. Substituted another man for my patient and had him killed. Evidently, replied Lucian, but I am almost as much in the dark as you are, Dr. Jorce. Tell me how Vrain came to be placed here, and in exchanging confidence for your confidence, I'll let you know all I have discovered since the death of the man in Geneva Square who called himself Berwin. That is a fair offer, replied Jorce, clearing his throat, and one which I willingly accept. I do not wish you to think that I am in league with Signor Ferrucci, and what I did was done honestly. I am not afraid of telling you my story. I am sure of that, replied Lucian heartily. I guessed that Ferrucci had not trusted you altogether, from the time he feigned that your evidence was needed only to decide a bet. Trust me, echoed Jorce with scorn. He never trusted me at all. He's too cunning for that. However, you shall hear. I'm all attention, Doctor. A week before last Christmas, Signor Ferrucci called to see me, and explained that he was interested in a gentleman named Michael Clear, whom he had met some years before in Italy. Clear, he said, had been most intimate with him, but later had indulged so much in the morphia habit that their friendship had terminated with high words. Afterwards, Clear had returned to England, and Ferrucci lost sight of him for some months. He visited England, and one day found Clear in the street, looking ill and wretched. The man had become a confirmed morphia maniac, and the habit had weakened his brain. The Count pitied the poor creature, according to his own story, and took him to his home, the whereabouts of which Clear was happily able to remember. "Where is the house?" asked Lucian, taking out his pocket-book. "Number 30, St. Bertha's Road, Bayswater," replied Jorce, and when the barrister, for his private information, had made a note of the address, he continued. It then appeared that Clear was married. The wife told Ferrucci that he was afraid of her husband, who, in his fits of drink, for he drank likewise, often threatened to kill her. They had lost their money, and the poor woman was at her wits' end what to do. Ferrucci explained to me that out of friendship he was most anxious to befriend Clear, and stated that Mrs. Clear wished to get her husband cured. He proposed, therefore, to put Clear into my asylum, and pay on behalf of his wife. "A very ingenious and plausible plan," said Lucian. "Well, doctor, what did you say?" I agreed, of course provided that the man was certified insane in the usual way. Ferrucci then departed, promising to bring Mrs. Clear to see me. He brought her late on Christmas Eve at 10. "Ah!" interrupted Lucian. "Did she wear a black gauze veil with velvet spots?" "She did, Mr. Denzil. Have you met her?" "No, but I have heard of her. She was the woman who visited Rent in Jersey Street. No doubt Ferrucci was waiting for her in the backyard." "Who is Rent?" asked Jorce, looking puzzled. "Don't you know the name, doctor?" "No." "Did Mrs. Clear ever mention it?" "Never." "Nor Ferrucci?" "No, I have never heard the name before," replied Jorce complacently. "Strange," said Denzil reflectively. "Yet Rent seems to be at the bottom of this whole plot. Well, never mind now. Please continue, my dear doctor. What did Mrs. Clear say?" "Oh, she repeated Ferrucci's story, amplified in a feminine fashion. She was afraid of Michael, who, when excited with morphia or drink, would snatch up a knife and attempt at her life. Twice she had to disarm him, and now she was very tired and frightened. She was willing for him to go into my asylum, since Count Ferrucci had so kindly consented to bear the expense. But she wished to give him one more chance. Then, as it was late, she stayed all night here. So did the Count, and on Christmas Day they went away." "What time did they come back?" "About a fortnight later, and they brought with them the man they both called Michael Clear." "What was he like?" "An old man with a white beard." "Is he mad?" asked Lucian bluntly. "He's not mad now, only weak in the head," replied Jorce professionally. "But he was certainly mad when he arrived. The man's brain was wrecked by morphia." "Not by drink?" "No, although it suited Mrs. Clear and Ferrucci to say so. But Clear, as I may call him, was very violent, and quite justified Mrs. Clear's desire to sequester him. She told me that he often imagined himself to be other people. Sometimes he would feign to be Napoleon, again the Pope, and when he, a week after he was in the asylum, insisted that he was Mark Vrain, I put it down to his delusion. But how do you think he came by that name, Doctor? My dear sir, at that time the papers were full of the case and its mystery, and as we have a reading room in the asylum, I fancied that Mr. Clear had seen the accounts, and had, as a delusion, called himself Vrain. Afterwards he fell into a kind of comatose state, and for weeks he said very little. He was at most abject and frightened, and responded in a timid sort of way to the name of Clear. Naturally, he confirmed me in his belief that his calling himself Vrain was a delusion, and he grew better, and one day he told me that his name was Vrain. Of course, I did not believe him. Still, he was so persistent about the matter that I thought there might be something in it, and I spoke to Ferrucci. What did he say? He denied the man's name was anything but Clear, that the wife and 2 doctors, for the poor soul had been duly certified as insane, had put them into the asylum, and together persisted so strongly that in his original story that I thought it was absurd to put a crazy man's delusion against a sane man's tale. Besides, everything regarding the certificate of sequestering of Clear had been quite legal. 2 doctors, and very rightly too, had certified to the insanity of the man, and his wife, as I then believed Mrs. Clear to be, had consented to his detention. What made you so suspicious that there might be something wrong? Asked Lucian eagerly. My visit to meet you, at Ferrucci's request, to prove the alibi, responded Jorce. I thought it was strange, and afterwards, when a man named Mr. Link called, I thought it was stranger still. But you did not see Link? No, I was in Italy then. But I heard of his visit. In Florence, I heard a most accomplished gossip of the whole story, of Mr. Vrain's marriage and his prior engagement of Mrs. Vrain to Ferrucci. I suggested that there might be some plot, but I could not quite understand how it was carried out, save that Vrain, as I then began Mr. Clear to be, had been placed in my asylum under a false name. On my return I intended to see you, when I was laid up in Florence with the fever. Now, however that we have met, tell me so much of the story as you know. Afterwards, we shall see Mr. Vrain. Lucian was willing enough to show his confidence in Jorce, the more so as he needed his help. Forthwith he told him all he knew, from the time he had met Michael Clear, alias Mark Berwin, alias Mark Vrain, in Geneva Square, down to the moment that he had presented himself for information at the gates of the Haven. Dr. Jorce listened with the greatest attention, his little face puckered up into a grim smile, and he shook his head when the barrister ended his recital. "A bad word, Mr. Denzil, a bad word," he said, rising. "Come with me, and I will take you to my patient." "But what do you think of it all?" said Denzil, eager for some comment. "I'll tell you that," rejoined Jorce, "when you have heard the story of Mr. Vrain." In a few minutes Lucian was led by his guide into a pleasant room, with French windows opening onto a wide veranda, a sunny lawn set round by flowers. Books were arranged on shelves around the wall, newspapers and magazines were on the table, and near the window, in a comfortable chair, sat an old man with a volume in his hand. As Jorce entered he stood up and shuffled forward with a senile smile of delight. Evidently, and with reason, poor soul, he considered the doctor his very good friend. "Well, well," said the cheery Jorce, "and how are you today, Mr. Vrain?" "I feel quite well," replied Vrain in a soft, weak voice. "Who is this doctor?" "A young friend of mine, Mr. Vrain. He wishes to hear your story." Alas, alas," sighed Vrain, his eyes filling with tears. "A sad story, sir." The father of Diana was of the middle height, with white hair and a long white beard, which swept his chest. On his cheek Lucian saw the cicatrix of which Diana had spoken, and mainly by which the dead man had been falsely identified as Vrain. He was very like Clear in figure and manner, but of course the resemblance in the face was not very close, as Clear had been clean-shaven, whereas the real Vrain wore a beard. The eyes were dim and weak-looking, and altogether Lucian saw that Vrain, not fitted to battle with the world in any way, and was quite weak enough to become the prey of villains, as had been his sad fate. "My name is Mark Vrain, young sir," he said, beginning the story without further preamble. "I lived in Berwin Manor, Bath, and my wife Lydia, but she treated me badly by letting another man love her, and I left her. Oh, yes, sir, I left her. I went away to Salisbury, and I was very happy there with my books, but alas, I took more—" "Vrain," said Jorce, holding up his finger. "No." Of course, said the old man with a watery smile. I mean I was very happy there, but Signor Ferrucci, a black-hearted villain," his face grew dark as he mentioned the name, "found me out, and made me come with him to London. He kept me there for months, and he brought me here." "Kept you where, Mr. Vrain?" asked Lucian gently. The old man looked at him with a vacant eye. "I don't know," he said in a dull voice. "You came from Bayswater," hinted Jorce. Yes, Bayswater," cried Vrain, growing excited. "I was there with a woman they called my wife. She was not my wife. My wife is fair. This woman was dark. Her name was Maud Clear. My wife's name is Lydia." "Did Mrs. Clear ever say that you were her husband, Michael?" "Yes, she called me Michael Clear, and brought me to stay with the doctor. But I am not Michael Clear." End of chapter 25. Recorded by Jeff Emmon in 2011 for LibriVox.org.
Chapter 26 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 26. The Other Man's Wife. As soon as Lucien arrived back in his rooms, he sat down at his desk and wrote a long letter to Diana, giving a full account of his extraordinary discovery of her father in Jorce's asylum, and advising her to come up at once to London. When he posted this, which he did the same night, he sighed to think it was not a love letter. He could have covered reams of paper with words of passion and adoration. He could have poured out his whole soul at the feet of his divinity, telling her of his love, his aspirations, his hopes and fears. No doubt from the common sense view, the letter would have been silly enough, but it would have relieved his mind and completed his happiness of knowing that he loved and was beloved. But in place of writing thus, he was compelled by his promise to Diana to pen a description of his late discovery, and interesting as the case was now growing, he found it irksome to detail the incident of the afternoon. He wished to be a lover, not a detective. So absent-minded and distraught was Lucien, that Miss Greeb, who had long suspected something was wrong with him, spoke that very evening about himself. She declared that Lucien was working too hard, that he needed another rest, although he had just returned from the country, and recommended a sleeping draught. Finally she produced a letter which had just arrived, and as it was in a female hand, Miss Greeb watched its effect on her admired lodger with the keen eyes of a jealous woman. When she saw him flush, and seized it eagerly, casting, meanwhile, an impatient look on her to leave the room, she knew the truth at once, and retired hurriedly to the kitchen, where she shed floods of tears. "I might have guessed it," gasped Miss Greeb to a comfortable cat which lay selfishly before the fire. "He's far too good-looking not to be snapped up. He'll be leaving me and setting up house with that other woman. I only hope she'll do for him as well as I have done. I wonder if she's beautiful and rich. Oh, how dreadful it all is." But the cat made no comment on this tearful address, not as much as a meow. It rolled over into a warmer place and went to sleep again. Cats are particularly selfish animals. 2 days afterwards, Miss Greeb opened the door to a tall and beautiful lady who asked for Mr. Denzil and was shown into his sitting room. With keen instinct, Miss Greeb decided that this was the woman who had taken possession of Lucian's heart, and being a just little creature, in spite of her jealousy, was obliged to admit that the visitor was as handsome as a picture. Then, seeing that there was no chance for her beside this splendid lady, she consoled herself with a dismal little proverb, and looked forward to the time when it would be necessary to put a ticket in the parlour window. Meanwhile, to have someone on whose bosom she could weep, Miss Greeb went round to see Mrs. Bensusan, leaving Diana in possession of Lucian, and the cat sole occupant of the kitchen. In the drawing-room, on the front floor, Diana, with her eyes shining like 2 stars, was talking to Lucian. She had come up at once on receipt of his letter. She had been to Hampstead, she had seen her father, and now she was telling Lucian about the visit. "He knew me at once, poor dear," she said rapidly, "and asked me if I'd been out, just as if I'd left the house for a visit and come back. Ah," she shook her head and sighed, "I'm afraid he'll never be quite himself again." "What does Jorce think?" "He says that father can be discharged as cured, and is going to see about it for me. Of course, he will never be quite sane, but he will never be violent so long as morphia and drugs of that sort are kept from him. As soon as he is discharged, I shall take him back to Bath, and put him in charge of Miss Barber. Then I shall return to town, and we must expose the whole conspiracy." "Conspiracy? What else do you call it, Lucian? That woman and Ferruci have planned and carried it out between them. They put my father into the asylum, and made another man pass as him, in order to get the assurance money. As their tool did not die quickly enough, they killed him. No, Diana, both Lydia and Ferruci have proved beyond all doubt that they were not in Pimlico at the hour of the death. I believe they contrived this conspiracy, but I don't believe they murdered Clear. Well, we shall see what defence they make. But one thing is certain, Lucian. Lydia will have to disgorge the assurance money. Yes, she certainly will, and I've no doubt the assurance company will prosecute her for fraud in obtaining it. I shall see Ferruci tomorrow and force him to confess his putting your father in the asylum." "No," said Diana, shaking her head. "Don't do that until you have more evidence against him." "I think the evidence of Jorce is strong enough. I suppose you mean the evidence of Mrs. Clear?" "Yes, although for her own sake I don't suppose she will speak." Lucian nodded. "I thought of that also," he said, "and yesterday I went to St. Bertha Street, Bayswater, to see her, but I found that she had moved, and no one knew where she was. I expect, having received her price for the conspiracy, she has left London. However, I put an advertisement in the papers, saying if she called on me here she would hear of something to her advantage. It is in the papers this morning." "I doubt if she will call," said Diana seriously. "What about the promised revelation of Rhoda?" "I believe that girl is deceiving me," cried Lucian angrily. "I went round to Jersey Street, as she asked me, and only saw Mrs. Bensusan, who said that Rhoda was out and would not be back for some time. Then I had to wait for you here and tell you all about your father, so the thing slipped my memory." I have not been near the place since, but I'll go round there tonight." "Whatever is Miss Greeb thinking of?" cried Lucian, breaking off quickly. "That front door bell has been ringing for at least 5 minutes." To Diana's amusement, Lucian went and shouted down the stairs to Miss Greeb, but as no reply came, and the bell was still ringing furiously, he was obliged to open the door himself. On the step there stood a little woman in a tailor-made brown frock, a plainly trimmed brown straw hat with a black gauze velvet-spotted veil. At once Denzil guessed who she was. "You are Mrs. Clear," he said, delighted that she had replied so quickly to his advertisement, for it had only that morning appeared in the newspapers. "Yes, I am," answered the woman in a quick, sharp voice. "Are you the L.D. who advertised for me?" "Yes, come upstairs. I have much to say to you." "Diana," said Lucian, on entering the room with his prize, "let me introduce you to Mrs. Clear." "Mrs. Clear, are you the wife of the man who was murdered in the house opposite?" Mrs. Clear uttered a cry of astonishment, and turned as if to retreat. But Denzil was between her and the door, so she saw that there was nothing for it but to outface the situation. As though she found it difficult to breathe, she threw up her veil, and Diana beheld a thin white face with two brilliant black eyes. "This is a trap," said Mrs. Clear hoarsely, looking from one to the other. "Who are you?" "I," said Lucian politely, "I am the man who met your husband before." "My husband? I have my husband in an asylum. You can't have met him." "You are telling a falsehood," said Diana fiercely. "The gentleman in the asylum of Dr. Joyce is not your husband, but my father." "Your father? And who are you?" "I am Diana Vrain." Mrs. Clear gave a screech and dropped back onto the sofa, staring at Diana with wide open and terrified eyes. "And now, Mrs. Clear, I see you realize the situation," Lucian said coldly. "You must confess your share in this conspiracy." "What conspiracy?" she interrupted furiously. "The putting of Mr. Vrain into an asylum, and passing off of your husband, Michael Clear, as him." "I don't know anything about it." "Come now, you talk nonsense. If you refuse to speak, I'll have you arrested at once." "Arrest me?" She bounded off the sofa with flashing eyes. "Yes, on a charge of conspiracy." "It is no use your getting angry, Mrs. Clear, for it won't improve your position. We, that is, this lady and myself, wish to know, firstly, how your husband came to be masquerading as Mr. Vrain. Secondly, where we can find the man called Wrent, who employed your husband. And thirdly, Mrs. Clear, we wish to know, and the law wishes to know, who killed your husband." "I don't know who killed him," said the woman, looking rather afraid, "but I believe Wrent did." "Who is Wrent?" "I don't know." "You don't know many things," said Diana, taking part in the conversation, "but you must tell us what you do know, otherwise I shall call in a policeman and have you arrested. You can't prove anything against me." "I think I can," said Lucian in the most cheerful manner. "I can prove that you were in number 13 of this square, seeing your husband, for I found on the fence dividing the backyard of that house from one in Jersey Street a scrap of a veil such as you wear. Also the landlady and the servant can prove that you called on Mr. Wrent several times, and were with him on the night of the murder. Then there is the evidence of your cloak, which you left behind, and which Wrent gave to the servant Rhoda. Also the evidence of Signor Ferruci." "Ferruci? What has he said about me?" Lucian saw that revenge might make the woman speak, so he lied in the calmest manner to get at the truth. Ferruci says that he contrived the whole conspiracy. So he did, said Mrs. Clear with a nod, and took you to the Haven at Hampstead on Christmas Eve. That's true. He took me from Wrent's house in Jersey Street. You need not go on, Mr. L.D. I admit the whole business. You do? Cried Lucian and Diana together. Yes, if only to spite that old villain Wrent, who has not paid me the money he promised. Before Lucian and Miss Vrain could express their pleasure at Mrs. Clear's coming to this sensible conclusion, the door opened suddenly, and little Miss Greeb, in a wonderful state of agitation, tripped in. "Oh, Mr. Denzil, I've just been to Mrs. Bensusan's, and Rhoda's run away." "Run away?" "Yes, she hasn't been back all day, and left a note for Mrs. Bensusan saying she was going to hide, because she was afraid." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 27. A Confession. Now indeed, Lucian had his hands full. Rhoda, the red-headed servant of Mrs. Bensusan, had run away on the plea that she was afraid of something. What she did not explain in the note she left behind her, and it was necessary that she should be discovered and forced into confessing what she knew of the conspiracy and murder. Mrs. Clear, not having been paid her hush money, had betrayed the confidence and misdeeds of Ferruci, thereby revealing an extent of villainy for which neither Diana nor Lucian was prepared. Now the Count had to be seen and brought to book for his doings. Lydia, informed that her husband was in the asylum and Vrain himself had to be released in due form from his legal imprisonment, how Lucian, even with the assistance of Diana, could deal with all these matters he did not know. "Why not see Mr. Link?" suggested Diana, when Mrs. Clear had departed, after making a clean breast of the nefarious transactions in which she had been involved. "He may take the case in hand again." "No doubt," responded Denzil dryly, "but I am not very keen to hand it over to him, seeing that he has abandoned it twice. Again, if I call in the police, it is all over with Lydia and the Count. They will be arrested and punished. For the murder of Clear? Perhaps, if it can be proved that they have anything to do with it. Certainly for the conspiracy to get the assurance money by the feigned death of your father." "Well," said Diana coldly, "and why should they not receive the rewards of their deeds?" "Quite so, but the question is, do you wish any scandal?" Diana was silent. She had not looked at the matter from this point of view. It was true what Lucian said. If the police took up the case again, Lydia and her accomplice would be arrested, and the whole sordid story of their doings would be in the papers. Diana was a proud woman, and winced at the idea of such publicity. It would be as well to avoid proceeding to such extremities. If the assurance money was returned by Lydia, she would be reduced to her former estate, and by timely flight might escape the vengeance of the defrauded company. After all, she was the wife of Vrain, and little as Diana liked her, she did not wish to see the woman who was so closely related to the wronged man put in prison, not for her own sake, but for the sake of the name she so unworthily bore. "I leave it in your hands," said Diana to Lucian, who was watching her closely. "Very good," replied Denzil, Then I think it will be best for me to see Ferruci first, and hear his confession. Afterwards call on Mrs. Vrain, and learn what she has to say. Then—" "Well," said Diana, curiously, "what then?" "I will be guided by circumstances. In the meantime, for the sake of your name, we had better keep the matter as quiet as possible. Mrs. Clear may speak out." "Mrs. Clear won't speak," said Denzil grimly. "She will keep quiet for her own sake. And as Rhoda has left Jersey Street, there will be no danger of trouble from that quarter. First, I'll see Lydia and the Count, to get to the bottom of this conspiracy. Then I'll set the police on Rhoda's track, that she may be arrested and made to confess her knowledge of the murder." "Do you think she knows anything?" "I think she knows everything," replied Lucian with emphasis. "That is why she has run away. If we capture her, and force her to speak, we may be able to arrest Wrent." "Why Wrent?" asked Diana. "Have you forgotten what Mrs. Clear said? I agreed with her that he is the assassin, although we can't prove it as yet." "But who is Wrent?" "Ah," said Lucian significantly, "that is just what I wish to find out." The upshot of this interview was that early the next morning Denzil went to the chambers of Ferruci in Marquis Street, and informed the servant that he wanted particularly to see the Count. At first the Italian, being still in bed, for he was a late riser, did not incline to grant his visitor an interview. But on second thoughts he ordered Lucian to be shown into the sitting room, and shortly afterwards joined him there wrapped in a dressing gown. He welcomed the barrister with a smiling nod, and having some instinct that Lucian came on an unpleasant errand, he did not offer him his hand. For the first the two men were on their guard against one another. "Good morning, sir," said Ferruci in his best English. "May I ask why you take me from my bed so early?" "To tell you a story." "About my friend Dr. Jorce saying I was with him on that night?" sneered the Count. "Partly, and partly about a lady you know." Ferruci frowned. "You speak of Mrs. Vrain?" "No," replied Lucian coolly. "I speak of Mrs. Clear." At the mention of this name, which was the last one he expected to hear his visitor pronounce, the Italian, in spite of his coolness and cunning, could not forbear a start. "Mrs. Clear?" he repeated. "And what do you know of Mrs. Clear?" "As much as Dr. Joyce could tell me, Count." Ferruci's brow cleared. "Then you know I pay for keeping her miserable husband with my friend," he said composedly. "It is for her sake I am so kind." "Rather it is for your own. You are so cunning." "Cunning? A most strange word for my goodness," said the Count coolly. "The most fit word, you mean," replied Lucian, impatient of this fencing. "It is no use beating about the bush, Count. I know that the man you keep in the asylum is not Clear, but Mark Vrain." "La, la, la! You talk great humbug. Mr. Vrain is dead and buried." "He is not dead," answered Lucian resolutely. "And the man who was buried under his name is Michael Clear, the husband of the woman who told me all." Ferruci, who had been pacing impatiently up and down the room, stopped short with a nervous laugh. "This is most amusing," he said, with an emotion he could not conceal despite his self-control. "Mrs. Clear told you all, eh?" "She told you what, my friend?" "That is the story I've come to tell you," replied Lucian sharply. "Very good," said Ferruci with a shrug. "I wait to hear this pretty story," and with a frown he threw himself into a chair near Lucian. Apparently he saw that he was found out, for it took him all his time to keep his voice from trembling and his hands from shaking. The man was not a coward, but being thus brought face to face with a peril he little expected, It was scarcely to be wondered at that he felt shaken and nervous. Moreover, he knew little about the English law, and hardly guessed how his misdeeds would be punished. Still he did not surrender on the spot, but listened quietly to Lucian's story, in the hope of seeing some way of escape from this awkward position. "The other day I went to Dr. Jorce's asylum," said Lucian slowly, "and there I discovered, it matters not how, that your friend Clear was Mr. Vrain. Also I learned that he had been placed in the asylum by you and Mrs. Clear. Jorce gave me her address in Bayswater, but when I went there I could not find her. She had left. I then put an advertisement in all the papers, stating that if she called on me she would hear of something to her advantage. Now, Count, it appears that Mrs. Clear was in the habit of looking into the papers to see if there was any message from yourself or your friend Wrent, so she saw my advertisement at once, and came in person to reply to it." "One moment, Mr. Denzil," said Ferruci politely. "I know no one called Wrent, and he is not my friend." "We'll come to that hereafter," answered Lucian, with a shrug. "In the meantime I'll proceed with my story, which I see interests you very much. Well, Count, it seems that Michael Clear was an actor, who bore a strong resemblance to Mr. Vrain, save that he had not a scar on his face. Vrain, at Bath, was always clean shaven. Now he wears a long white beard, but that is neither here nor there. Clear had a moustache, but when that was shaved off he looked exactly like Vrain. For purposes of your own, which you can easily guess, you made the acquaintance of this man, a profligate and drunkard, and proposed, for a certain sum of money to be paid to his wife, that he, Michael Clear, should personate Vrain and live in the Silent House in Geneva Square under the name of Berwin. You knew that Clear was slowly dying of consumption and drink, so you trusted that he would die as Vrain, that Mrs. Vrain, who I believe is in the plot, would recognize the corpse by the description in the newspapers, and that, when Clear was buried as Vrain, she would get the assurance money and marry you." "That is clever," said the Count with a sneer. "But is it true?" "You know best," answered Lucian coolly. "However, all turned out as you expected, for Clear died as Vrain, or rather was murdered at your command. As he did not die quickly enough, his body was recognized by Mrs. Vrain, buried as her husband, and she got the assurance money. The only thing that remains for your conspiracy to be entirely successful is that Mrs. Vrain should marry you, and, as I was told by Mr. Klein, that has pretty well been arranged." "Do you think, then, that Klein would let his daughter marry a man who has done all this?" said Ferruci, who was now very pale. "I don't believe Klein knows anything about it," replied Lucian coldly. "You and Mrs. Vrain made up this pretty plot between you. Vrain himself told me how you decoyed him from Salisbury, and took him to Mrs. Clear's in Bayswater, where he passed as her husband, although, as she confesses, she kept him as a kind of prisoner." "But this is wrong," cried Ferruci, trying to laugh. "This is most foolish. How would a man of his own will pass as the husband of a woman he knew not?" "A sane man would not. But none knew better than you, Count, that Vrain was not sane, and that you dosed him with drugs, and let Mrs. Clear keep him locked up in her house until you put him in the asylum. Vrain was a puppet in your hands, and you locked him up in an asylum a fortnight after the man who personated him was murdered. You intended to marry Mrs. Vrain, and keep her wretched husband in that asylum all his life." "The best place for a lunatic," said Ferruci. "Ah!" cried Lucian. "Then you admit that Vrain was mad?" I admit nothing, not even that he is alive, if what you say is true," said the Italian cunningly. "How came it that the murdered man had the scar on his cheek? He might have been like Vrain, eh? But not so much." "Mrs. Clear explained that," replied Lucian quickly. "You made that scar, Count, with vitriol or some such stuff. You don't know chemistry for nothing, I see." "I am quite ignorant of chemistry," said Ferruci sullenly. "Jorce heard a different story in Florence." "In Florence? Did Jorce ask about me there?" said the Count in alarm. "He did, and heard some strange tales, Count. Come, now, it's no use you trying to evade this matter further. Jorce can prove that you put Vrain into his asylum under the name of Clear. Miss Vrain can prove that the so-called Clear is her father, and Mrs. Clear, who has turned Queen's evidence, has exposed the whole of your conspiracy. The game's up, Count." Ferruci sprang from his seat and began to walk hastily up and down the room. He looked haggard and pale, and years older, as he recognized his position, for he saw very plainly that he was trapped, and that nothing remained to him but flight. But how to fly? He stopped opposite to Lucian. "What do you intend to do?" he demanded in a hoarse voice. "Have you arrested along with Mrs. Vrain," replied Lucian, making this threat to force Ferruci into defending himself or confessing. "Mrs. Vrain is innocent. She knows nothing about this conspiracy, as you call it. I planned the whole thing myself." "You admit, then, that the so-called Vrain was really Michael Clear?" "Yes, I got him to personate the man Vrain, so that I could get the assurance money when I married Lydia. I chose Clear because he was like Vrain. I made the scar on the cheek, and I thought he would die soon, being consumptive." "And you killed him?" "No, no, I swear I did not kill him." "Did you not take the stiletto from Berwin Manor?" "No, I never did." "I am telling the truth. I do not know who killed Clear." "Did you not visit Wrent in Jersey Street?" "Yes, I was the man Rhoda saw in the backyard. I was waiting for Mrs. Clear, to take her to Hampstead, and in the meantime I thought I would climb over the fence and see Clear. But the girl saw me, so I ran away and joined Mrs. Clear up the road. I was not aware at the time that the woman who saw me was Rhoda. Afterwards I went to Hampstead with Mrs. Clear to see Jorce." "Did you buy the cloak?" "I did. That girl in Baxter and Company told a lie for me. I was warned by Mrs. Vrain that you had made questions about the cloak, so I went to the girl and told her that you were a jealous husband, and paid her to say it was not I who bought the cloak. She did so, quite ignorant of the real reason I wished her to deny knowing me." "Why did you buy the cloak?" asked Lucian, satisfied with this explanation. "I bought it for Wrent. He asked me to buy it, but what he wanted it for I do not know. He had it some days before Christmas, and, I believe, he gave it to Mrs. Clear, and afterwards to the girl Rhoda. But of this I am not sure." "Who is Wrent?" asked Denzil, reserving the most important question for the last. "Wrent?" said Ferruci, smiling in a sneering way. "Ah, you wish to know who Wrent is? Well, excuse me for a few minutes, and I'll bring you something to show who he is." With a nod to Lucian, he passed into his bedroom, leaving the barrister much astonished. He thought that Ferruci was Wrent himself, and had gone away to resume the disguise of wig and beard. While he pondered thus, the Count reappeared, carrying a small bottle in his hand. "Mr. Denzil," said he, with a ghastly smile, "I have played a bold game, and, thanks to a woman's treachery, I have lost. I hope to get £20,000 and a charming wife, but I have gained nothing but poverty and a chance of imprisonment. But I am of noble birth, and I will not survive my dishonour. You wish to know who Wrent is? You shall never know." He raised the bottle to his lips before Lucian, motionless with horror, could rush forward, and the next moment Count Hercule Ferruci was lying dead on the floor. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 28. The Name of the Assassin. That afternoon London was ringing with the news of Ferruci's suicide, but no paper could give any reason for the rash act. This inability was due to the police, who, anxious to capture those concerned in the conspiracy to obtain the assurance money of the Cyrus Company, kept everything they could out of the papers, lest Lydia and Wrent should be put on their guard, and so escape. Lucian had been forced to report the death of Ferruci to the authorities. Now the case was out of his hands again, and in those of Link, who blamed the young barrister severely for not having brought him into the matter before. The detective was always more prone to blame than to praise. "But what could I do?" cried Lucian angrily. "You threw up the case twice. You said the assassin of Clear, or, as you thought, Vrain would never be discovered." "I did my best and failed," retorted Link, who did not like his position. "You have had better luck and have succeeded." "My luck has been sheer hard work, Link. I was not so faint-hearted as you to draw back at the first check." "Well, well, the whole truth hasn't been discovered yet, Mr. Denzil, as you have found out this conspiracy. I may learn who the assassin is." "We know that already. The assassin is Wrent." "You have yet to prove that." "I?" said Lucian with disdain. "I proved nothing. I wash my hands of the whole affair." "You are a detective. Let me see what you will make of a case which has baffled you twice." And Denzil, with rage in his heart, went off, laughing at the discomfiture of Link. At that moment the detective hated his successful rival with his whole heart. Lucian took a hansom to the Royal John Hotel in Kensington, where Diana, in a great state of alarm, was reading the evening papers, which contained short notices of Ferruci's death. On seeing her lover, she hurried forward anxiously and caught him by the hand. "Lucian, I'm so glad you have come," she cried, leading him to a chair. "I sent messages both to Geneva Square and Sergeant's Inn, but you were neither at your lodgings nor in your office." "I was better employed, my dear," said Lucian with a weary sigh, for he was quite worn out with fatigue and anxiety. "I have been with Link, telling him about Ferruci's death, and being blamed as the cause of it." "You blamed? And why?" said Diana with just indignation. "Because I forced Ferruci to confess the truth, and when he saw that there was every chance of his being put into jail for his villainy, he went to his bedroom and took poison. You know, Mrs. Clear said the man was something of a chemist, so I suppose he prepared the poison himself. It was very swift in its action, for he dropped dead before I could recover my presence of mind." "Lucian, this is terrible!" cried Diana, wringing her hands. You may well say that, he replied gloomily. Now the whole details of the case will be in the papers, and that unfortunate woman will be arrested. Lydia! And what will her father say? It will break his heart. Perhaps he must take the consequences of having brought up his daughter so badly. Still, added Lucian reflectively, I do not believe that Lydia is so guilty as Wrent. That scoundrel seems to be at the bottom of the affair. Ferruci and he contrived and carried out the whole thing between them, and a precious pair of villains they are. Will Wrent be arrested? If he can be found. But I fancy the scoundrel has made himself scarce out of fright. Since he left Jersey Street after the murder, he has not been heard of. Even Mrs. Clear does not know where he is. You know she has put advertisements in the paper in this cipher he gave her, according to the arrangements between them. But Wrent has not turned up. And Rhoda? Rhoda is still missing. The police are getting warrants out for the servant, for Wrent, and for Mrs. Clear, and for Lydia Vrain. Ferruci, luckily for himself and his family, has escaped the law by his own act. It was the wisest thing the scoundrel could do to kill himself and avoid the dishonour. I must admit the man had pluck. It is terrible, terrible. What will be the end of it? Imprisonment for the lot, I expect. Unless they can prove that Wrent murdered Clear, then they will hang him. But now that Ferruci is dead, I fancy Rhoda is the only witness who can prove Wrent's guilt. That is why she ran away. I don't wonder she was afraid to stay. But I feel quite worn out with all this, Diana. Please give me a biscuit and a glass of port. I have had nothing all day." With a sigh, Diana touched the bell, and when the waiter made his appearance, gave the order. She felt low-spirited and nervous, in spite of the discovery that her father was alive and well, and indeed the extraordinary events of the last few days were sufficient to upset the strongest mind. Lucian was leaning back in his chair with closed eyes, for his head was aching with the excitement of the morning. Suddenly he opened them and jumped up. At the same time Diana threw open the door with an exclamation, and both of them heard the thin, high voice of a woman who apparently was coming up the stairs. "Never mind my name," said the voice. "I'll tell it to Miss Vrain myself. Take me to her at once." "Lydia!" cried Lucian. "And here? Great heavens! Why does she come here?" Diana said nothing, but compressed her lips as Lydia, followed by the waiter with biscuits and wine, came into the room. She was plainly and neatly dressed, and wore a heavy veil, but seemed greatly excited. She did not say a word, nor did Diana, until the waiter left the room and closed the door. Then she threw up her veil, revealing a haggard face and red eyes, swollen with weeping and filled with an expression of terror. "Sakes alive, isn't this awful?" she wailed, making a clutch at Miss Vrain's arm. "You've done it this time, Diana. Ferruci's dead, and your father's alive. And I'm not a widow, and my father away, and I don't know where. I was told that the police were after me, so I'm clearing out." "Clearing out, Mrs. Vrain?" repeated Diana stiffly. "I should think so," sobbed Lydia. "I don't want to stay and be put in jail, though what I've done to be put in jail for, I don't know." "What?" cried Lucian indignantly. "You don't know, when this abominable conspiracy is—" "I know nothing of the conspiracy," interrupted Lydia. "Did you not get Ferruci to put your husband into an asylum?" "I did nothing of the sort. I thought my husband was dead and buried until Ferruci told me the truth, and then I held my tongue until I could think of what to do. After Ercole died, his servant came round and told me all. He overheard the conversation you had with the Count, Mr. Denzil. I was never so astonished in my life as to hear about Mrs. Clear and her husband, and Mark alive, oh Lord, isn't it dreadful? Give me a glass of wine, Diana, or I'll go right off in a dead faint." In silence, Miss Vrain poured out a glass of port and handed it to her stepmother, who sipped it in a most tearful mood. Lucian looked at the wretched little woman without saying a word, and wondered if, indeed, she was innocent as she made herself out to be. He thought that, after all, she might be ignorant of Ferruci's plots, although she had certainly benefited by them. But she was such a glib liar that he did not know how much to believe of her story. However, she had hitherto only given a general idea of her connection with the matter, so when she had finished her wine and was somewhat calmer, Lucian begged her to be more explicit. "Did you know, did you guess, or even suspect that your husband was alive?" "Mr. Denzil," said Lydia, with unusual solemnity, "as I'm a married woman, and not the widow I thought I was, I did not know that Mark was alive. I'm bad, I daresay, but I'm not bad enough to shut a man up in a lunatic asylum and pretend he is dead, just to get money, much as I like it. What I did about identifying the corpse was done in good faith." "You really thought it was my father's body?" questioned Diana doubtfully. "I swear I did," responded Mrs. Vrain emphatically. "Mark walked out of the house because he thought I was carrying on with Ferruci, which I wasn't. It was that Tyler cat who made the trouble between us, and Mark was so weak and silly, half crazy, I think, with his morphia and overstudy, that he cleared right out, and I never knew where he had gone to. When I saw that notice about the murdered man in Geneva Square who called himself Berwin and was marked on the cheek, I thought he might be my husband. When the coffin was open, I really believed I saw poor Mark's dead body. The face was just like his, and scarred in the same way." "What about the missing finger, Mrs. Vrain? If I remember, you even gave cause for its loss." "Well, it was this way," replied Lydia, somewhat discomposed. "I knew that Mark hadn't lost a finger when he left, but Ferruci said that if I denied it, the police might refuse to believe that the body was that of my husband. So, as I was sure it was Mark's corpse, I just said he had lost a finger out west. I didn't think there was any harm in saying so, as for all I knew he might have got it chopped off after leaving me. But the face of the dead man was, as I thought, Mark's, and he called himself Berwin, which, you know, Diana, is the name of the manor, and the scar was on the cheek, and I know now it was all contrived by Hercule, but then I was quite ignorant." "When did you find out the truth?" "After that cloak business. Ferruci came to me, and I told him what that girl at Baxter had said, and insisted that he should tell me the truth. Well, he did, in order to force me to marry him, and then I told him to go and make it right with the girl, so that when Mr. Denzil went again, she denied that Hercule had bought the cloak." "She denied it, sure enough," said Lucian grimly. "Ferruci, before he died, told me he had bribed her to speak falsely. What more did the Count reveal to you, Mrs. Vrain? The conspiracy?" "Yes, he said he found Mark hiding at Salisbury, half mad with morphia, and had taken him up to Mrs. Clear's, where it seems he went mad altogether, so they locked him up as her husband in a lunatic asylum. Ferruci also told me that he had seen Michael Clear on the stage, and that as he was so like Mark, and was likely to die of drink and consumption, he got him to play the part of Mark in Geneva Square. under the name of Berwin. Mrs. Clear visited her husband there by climbing over a back fence and getting down a cellar somehow. "I know that," said Lucian. "It was Mrs. Clear's shadow I saw on the blind. She was fighting with her husband, and when I rang the bell, they were both so alarmed that they left the house by the back way and got into Jersey Street. Then Mrs. Clear went home, and the man himself came round into the square by the front way. That was how I met him. I wondered how people were in the house during his absence. Mrs. Clear told me all." "Did she say why her husband made you examine the house?" asked Diana. "No, but I expect he made me do so that I should not have my suspicions about the back entrance." "But, Mrs. Vrain, when Ferruci confessed that your husband was alive, why did you not tell it to the world?" "Well, I got the assurance money, you see," said Lydia with shrewd candour, "and I thought the company would make a fuss and take it back, as I suppose they will now. Ferruci wanted me to marry him, but I wasn't so bad as that. I didn't want to commit bigamy, but I really held my tongue because Ferruci told me who killed Clear." "He knew, then," cried Lucian, "and denied it to me. Who killed the man?" "Wrent did, the man who lived in Jersey Street." "And who is at the bottom of the whole plot?" said Lucian furiously. "Do you know where he is to be found?" "Yes," said Lydia boldly, "I do. But I am not going to tell you where he is." "Why not?" "Because I don't want him punished." "But I do," said Diana angrily. "He is a wretch who ought to suffer." "Very well," said Lydia, loudly and spitefully. "Then make him suffer, for this Wrent is your own father. It was Mark who killed Michael Clear." End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 29. Link Sets a Trap. In the course of their acquaintance, Diana had put up with a great deal from the little American adventuress, owing to her position of stepmother. But when she heard her accusing the man she had ruined of murder, the patience of Miss Vrain gave way. She rose quickly, and walking over to where Lydia was shrinking in her chair, towered in righteous indignation above the shameless little woman. "You lie, Mrs. Vrain!" she said in a low, distinct voice, with a flushed face and indignation in her eyes. "You know you lie!" I only repeat what Ferruci told me," whimpered Lydia, rather alarmed by the attitude of her stepdaughter. "I'm sure I hope Mark didn't kill the man, but Ercole said that he was in Jersey Street for that purpose." "It is not true! My father was in the asylum at Hampstead." "Indeed he wasn't, not at the time Clear was killed," protested Lydia. "He was not put into the asylum until at least 2 weeks after Christmas. Is that not so, Mr. Denzil?" "It is so," assented Lucian gravely. "But even admitting so much, it is impossible to believe that Mr. Vrain was in Jersey Street. For many months before Christmas he was in charge of Mrs. Clear at Bayswater." "So Ercole said," replied Lydia. "But he used to get away from Mrs. Clear at times, and had to be brought back." "He wandered when he got the chance," said Lucian, with hesitation. "I admit as much." "Well, then, when he was not at Bayswater he used to live in Jersey Street as Wrent. Ferruci found him out there, and tried to get him to go back, and he took Mrs. Clear several times to the same place in order to persuade him to return to Bayswater. That was why Mrs. Clear visited Jersey Street. Oh, Mark played his part there as Mr. Wrent, I guess. There ain't no two questions about that," finished Lydia triumphantly. "He is the assassin, you bet." "I don't believe it!" cried Diana furiously. "Why, my father is too weak in the head to have the will, let alone the courage, to masquerade like that. He is like a child in leading strings." "That's his cunning, Diana. He's cute enough to pretend madness so that he won't be hanged." "It is impossible that Vrain can be Wrent," said Lucian decidedly. "I agree with Miss Vrain. He is too weak and irresponsible to carry out such a deed. Besides, I don't see how you prove him guilty of the murder. You do not even know that he could enter the Silent House by the secret way." "I don't know anything about it, except what Count Ferruci told me," said Lydia obstinately. "And he said that Vrain, as Wrent, killed Clear. But you can easily prove if it's true or not." "How can we prove it?" asked Diana coldly. "By laying a trap for Mark. You know, at least Ercole told me, and I suppose Mrs. Clear told you, that she corresponded with Mark Wrent, I mean in the agony column of the Daily Telegraph." "By means of a cipher? Yes, I know that, but she hasn't received any answer yet." "Of course not," replied Lydia with triumph, "because Wrent that's Mark, you know is in the asylum and can't answer her." "This is all nonsense," broke in Lucian, impatient of this cobweb spinning. "I don't believe a word of Ferruci's story. If Vrain lived in Jersey Street as Wrent, why should Mrs. Clear visit him? To get him back to Bayswater." "Nonsense! Nonsense! And even admitting as much, why should Mrs. Clear, in the newspapers, correspond in cipher with a man whom she not only knows is in an asylum as her husband, but who can be seen by her at any time?" "I quite agree with you, Lucian," cried Diana emphatically. "Count Ferruci told a pack of falsehoods to Mrs. Vrain. The thing is utterly absurd." "Oh, I guess I'm not so easily made a fool of as all that!" cried Lydia, firing up. "If you don't believe me, lay the trap I told you of. Let Mark go free out of the asylum. Get Mrs. Clear, with her cipher and newspapers, to ask him to meet her in the house where Clear was murdered, and then you'll see if Mark won't turn up in his character of Wrent." "He will not!" cried Diana vehemently. "He will not!" "Mark, when he left me," went on the angry Lydia, "had plenty of hair, and was clean shaven. Now, as Ferruci told me, for I haven't seen him, he is bald, and wears a skull cap of black velvet and a white beard. After Ercole told me about Jersey Street, I went there to ask that fat woman about Mark. She said he'd gone away 2 days after Christmas, and described him as an old man with a skull cap and a white beard." "Oh!" cried Lucian, for he recollected that Rhoda gave the same description. "Ah, you know I speak the truth," said Lydia, rising. "But I've had enough of all this. I've lost my money, and I don't suppose I'll go back to Mark. I've been treated badly all round, and I don't know what papa will say. But I'm going out of London to meet him." "You said you did not know where your father was," cried Diana scornfully. "I don't tell you everything, Diana," retorted Lydia, looking very wicked. "But, if you must know, papa went over to Paris last week, and I'm going over there to meet him. He'll raise Cain for the way I've been treated." "Well," said Lucian, as she prepared to take her leave, "I hope you'll get away." "Do you intend to stop me, Mr. Denzil?" flashed out Mrs. Vrain furiously. "Not I. But I'll give you a hint. The railway stations will be watched by the police." "For me?" said Lydia, with a scared expression. "Oh, sakes! It's awful! And I've done nothing. It's not my fault if I got the assurance money. I really thought that Mark was dead. But I'll try and get away to papa. He'll put things right. Good bye, Mr. Denzil. And Diana, you've done me a heap of harm. But I don't bear malice." And Mrs. Vrain rushed out of the room in a great hurry to escape the chance of arrest hinted at by Lucian. She had a sharp eye to her own safety. Diana waited while the cab which Lydia had kept waiting was driving away, and then turned with an anxious expression on her face to look at Lucian. "My dear," she said, taking his arm, "what do you think of Lydia's accusation?" "Against your father?" said Lucian. "Why, I don't believe it." "Nor do I. But it will be as well to set the trap she suggests, for if my father does not fall into it, and as he's not Wrent I don't believe he will, the real man may keep the appointment with Mrs. Clear." "Whosoever Wrent is, I don't think he'll come again to the Silent House," replied the barrister, shaking his head. "It would be thrusting his head into the lion's jaws. If he is in London he'll see the death of Ferruci described in the papers, and no doubt will guess that the game is up. So he'll keep away." "Nevertheless, we'll do as Lydia suggests," said Diana obstinately. "You see Mr. Link and Mrs. Clear and arrange about the cipher. Then my father's to be discharged as cured to-morrow, and I'll let him go out if he pleases. Of course I'll follow him. Then I'll be able to see if he goes to Pimlico." "But, Diana, suppose he does go to the Silent House and proves to be Wrent?" "He won't do that, my dear. My father is no more Wrent than you are. I believe Lydia speaks in the full belief that he is, but Ferruci, for his own ends, lied to her. However, to trap the real man, let us do as Lydia suggests. The idea is a good one." "Well, we'll try," said Lucian with a sigh. "But I do hope, Diana, that this case will end soon. Every week there is some fresh development, in a new direction, and I am getting quite bewildered over it. It will end with the capture of Wrent, the assassin." "I hope so. And God grant Wrent does not prove to be your father." "There is no fear of that," said Diana gravely. "My father is insane, more or less, but he is not a murderer. I'm quite content to risk the trap suggested by that woman." Lucian did not at once adopt the plan to net Wrent, whosoever he might be, invented by Lydia and approved of by Diana. On the whole, he could not bring himself to believe that a weak-headed, foolish old creature like Vrain had masqueraded in Jersey Street as Wrent. Still, there were certain suspicious incidents which fitted in very neatly with Ferruci's story. Mrs. Clear had stated that Vrain, when under her charge, escaped several times, and had remained away for several days, until brought back again by the Count. Again, the appearance of Wrent, as described by Rhoda, was precisely the same as the looks of Vrain when Lucian saw him in the Hampstead asylum, so it seemed that there might be some truth in the story. "But it's impossible," said Lucian to himself. "Vrain is half mad, and incapable of conducting his own life, or arranging so cleverly to commit a crime. Also, he had no money, and had he lived in Jersey Street would not have been able to pay Mrs. Bensusan. There is something more in the coincidence of this similarity of looks than meets the eye. I'll see Link and hear what he has to say on the subject. It's time he found out something." The next day Lucian paid a visit to Link, but was not received very amiably by that gentleman, who proved to be in a somewhat bad temper. He was not altogether pleased with Lucian finding out more about the case than he had discovered himself, and also, to further ruffle his temper, the clever Lydia had given him the slip. He had called at her Mayfair house with a warrant for her arrest, only to find out that, having received timely warning from Ferruci's servant, she had fled. In vain the railway stations had been watched. Lydia, taking the hint given to her by Lucian, had baffled that peril by taking the Dover train at a station outside London. Lucian heard what Link had to say on the subject, but did not reveal the fact that Lydia had paid a visit to Diana, or had gone to meet her father at Dover. He did not want to give the little woman up to justice, as he was beginning to believe her innocent, and that, in all truth, she had known nothing of the Ferruci-Wrent conspiracy. Therefore, giving no information to Link as to the little woman's whereabouts, Denzil told, as coming from himself, his idea that Wrent might fall into a trap set for him at the Pimlico house by means of Mrs. Clear's cipher. Link listened to the tale attentively, and decided to adopt the idea. "It is a good one," he admitted generously, "and I'm not jealous enough to cut off my nose to spite my face. You have had the better of me all through this case, Mr. Denzil, and we have had words over it, but I'll show you that I can appreciate your cleverness by adopting your plan." "I am greatly obliged to you for your good opinion," said Lucian dryly, for he saw with some humour that Link was only too anxious to benefit by the very cleverness of which he pretended to be so jealous. "And you will see Mrs. Clear?" "Yes. I'll see her at once, and get her to invite Wrent to Pimlico by that cipher, with a threat that she will betray the whole plot if he does not come." "I dare say he knows already that Mrs. Clear is a traitress?" "Impossible!" replied Link quickly. "I have kept Mrs. Clear's name out of the papers. It is known that Ferruci is dead, and that Mrs. Vrain is likely to be arrested in connection with her supposed husband's murder. But the fact of Mrs. Clear putting the real Vrain into the asylum is not known, nor, indeed, anything about the woman. If Wrent thinks she'll tell tales, he'll meet her in their own hunting grounds in Geneva Square, to make his terms. Hitherto he has not replied to her request for money, but now he'll think she's driven into a corner and will fix her up once and for all. Do you think that Wrent is Vrain?" "Good Lord, no!" replied Link, staring. "What put that into your head?" Lucian immediately told him about the supposed connection between Vrain and Wrent, but suppressing that it was Lydia's or Ferruci's idea, based his supposition on the fact of the resemblance between the two men. Link heard the theory with scorn, and scouted the idea that the two men could be one and the same. "I've seen Vrain," he said. "The old man is as mad as a March hare and as silly as a child. He's in his dotage, and could not possibly carry out such a plan. But we can easily learn the truth." "From whom?" asked Lucian. "Ah, Mr. Denzil, you are not so clever as you think yourself," scoffed Link. "Why, from Mrs. Clear, to be sure. She visited at Jersey Street, and saw Wrent, and as Vrain was then with her in the character of her husband, she'll be able to tell us if they are two men or one person." "You are right, Link. I never thought of that." "He, he! Then I can still teach you something," replied Link, in high good humor at having for once scored off the too clever barrister, and forthwith went off to see Mrs. Clear. How this interview with that lady sped, or what she told him, he refused to reveal to Lucian, but its result was that a cipher appeared in the agony column of the Daily Telegraph, calling upon Wrent to meet her in the Silent House in Pimlico, under the penalty of her telling the police all she knew if he did not come. In the same issue of the paper in which this message appeared, there was a paragraph stating that Mrs. Vrain had been arrested at Dover. End of chapter 29. Recording by Amanda Friday. Chapter 30 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 30. Who Fell into the Trap. However closely one may study the fair sex, there is no understanding them in the least. No one can say how a woman will act in a given situation, for feminine actions are based less on logical foundations than on the emotion of the moment. Diana had never liked Lydia. When the American girl became her stepmother she hated her, and not only said as much but showed in her every action that she believed what she said. She declared that she would be glad to see Lydia deprived of her money and put into jail. The punishment would be no more than she deserved. Yet when these things came to pass, when, by the discovery that Vrain yet lived, Lydia lost her liberty, and when, as connected with the conspiracy, she was arrested on a criminal warrant and put into prison, Diana was the only friend she had. Miss Vrain declared that her stepmother was innocent, visited her in prison, and engaged a lawyer to defend her. Lucian could not forbear pointing out the discrepancy between Diana's past sentiments and her present actions, but Miss Vrain was quite ready with an excuse. "I am only doing my duty," she said. "In herself I like Lydia as little as ever I did, but I think we've suspected her wrongly in being connected with this conspiracy, so I wish to help her if possible. And after all," added Diana, "she is my father's wife," as if that fact extenuated all. "He has reason to know it," replied Lucian bitterly. "If it had not been for Lydia, your father would not have left his home for a lunatic asylum, nor would Clear have been murdered." "I quite agree with you, Lucian, but some good has come out of this evil, for if things had not been as they are, you and I would never have met." "Egad, that is true!" said Lucian, kissing her. "It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good." So Diana played the part of a good Samaritan towards her stepmother, and helped her to bear the evil of being thrust into prison. Lydia wrote to her father in Paris, but received no reply, and therefore was without a friend in the world save Diana. Later on she was admitted to bail, and Diana took her to the hotel in Kensington, there to wait for the arrival of Mr. Clyne. His absence and silence were both unaccountable. "I hope nothing's wrong with papa," wept Lydia. "As a rule, he's always smart in replying, and if he's seen about Ercole's death and my imprisonment in the papers, I'm sure he'll be over soon." While she was thus waiting for her father, and Link in every way was seeking evidence against her, Mrs. Clear received an answer to her message. In the same column of the Daily Telegraph, and in the same cipher, there appeared a message from Wrent that he would meet Mrs. Clear at No. 13 Geneva Square. Link was delighted when Mrs. Clear showed him this, and rubbed his hands with much pleasure. Affairs were about to be brought to a crisis, and as Link was the moving spirit in the matter, his vanity was sufficiently gratified as to make him quite amiable. "We've got him this time, Mr. Denzil," he said with enthusiasm. "You and I and a couple of policemen will go down to that house in Geneva Square. By the front, sir, by the front." "Mrs. Clear also?" questioned Lucian, wishing to be enlightened on all points. "No. She'll come in by the back, down the cellar way, as Wrent expects her to come. Then he'll follow in the same path and walk right into the trap." "But won't the two be seen climbing over that fence in the daytime?" asked the barrister doubtfully. "Who said anything about the daytime, Mr. Denzil? I did not. And Wrent knows too much to risk himself at a time that he can be seen from the windows of the adjacent houses. No, no, the meeting with Mrs. Clear is to take place in the front room at 10 o'clock, when it will be quite dark. You and I and the policeman will hide in what was the bedroom, and listen to what Wrent has to say to Mrs. Clear. We'll give him rope enough to hang himself, sir, and then pounce out and nab him." "Well, he won't show much fight if he is Mr. Vrain." "I don't believe he is Mr. Vrain," retorted the detective bluntly. "I am doubtful of that also," admitted Lucian. "But you know Vrain is now out of the asylum, and for the time being has been left to his own devices. The reply to the cipher did not appear until he was in that position. Supposing, after all, this mysterious Wrent proves to be this unhappy man? In that case he'll have to pay for his whistle, sir." "You mean in connection with the conspiracy?" "Yes, and perhaps with the murder of Clear, but we don't know if the so-called Wrent committed the crime. For such reason, Mr. Denzil, I wish to overhear what he says to Mrs. Clear. It is as well to give him enough rope to hang himself with." "Can you trust Mrs. Clear?" "Absolutely. She knows on which side her bread is buttered. Her only chance of getting free from her share of the matter is to turn Queen's evidence, and she intends to do so." "What did she say about Vrain being Wrent?" "Well, sir," said Link, putting his head on one side, and looking at Lucian with an odd expression, "you had better wait till the man's caught before I answer that question. Then maybe you won't require an answer." "It is very probable I won't," replied Lucian dryly. "What time am I to see you to-night?" "I'll call for you at 9 o'clock sharp, and we'll go across to the house at once. I have the key in my pocket now. Peacock gave it to me this morning. The scene will be quite dramatic." "I hope it won't prove to be Vrain," said Lucian restlessly, for he thought how grieved Diana would be. "I hope not," answered Link curtly, "but there's no knowing. However, if the old man does get into trouble, he can plead insanity. His having been in the asylum of Jorce is a strong card for him to play. Good day, Mr. Denzil. I'll see you to-night at 9 o'clock sharp." "Good day," replied Lucian, and the pair parted for the time being. Lucian did not go near Diana that day. In the first place, he did not wish to see Lydia, for whom he had no great love, and in the second, he was afraid to speak to Diana as to the possibility of her father being Wrent. Diana, as a good daughter should, held firmly to the idea that her father could not behave in such a way, and as a sensible woman, she did not think that a man with so few of his senses about him could have acted the dual part with which he was credited without, in some measure, betraying himself. Lucian was somewhat of this opinion himself, yet he had an uneasy feeling that Vrain might prove to be the culprit. The fact of Vrain's being often away from Mrs. Clear's house in Bayswater, and Wrent absent in the same way from Mrs. Bensusan's house in Jersey Street, appeared strange, and argued a connection between the two. Again, the resemblance between them was most extraordinary and unaccountable. On the whole, Lucian was not satisfied in his mind as to what would be the end of the matter, and had he known Mrs. Clear's address he would have gone to question her about it. But only Link knew where the woman was to be found, and kept that information to himself, especially from Denzil. Now that he had the reins once more in his hands, he did not intend that the barrister should take them again. Punctual to the minute, Link, in a state of subdued excitement, came to Lucian's rooms. Already he had sent his 2 policemen over to the house, into which he had instructed them to enter in the quietest and most unostentatious manner, and now came to escort the barrister across. Lucian put on his hat at once, and the two walked out into the dark night, for dark it was, with no moon, few stars, and a great many clouds. A most satisfactory night for their purpose. "All the better," said Link, casting a look round the deserted square. "All the better for our little game. I wish to secure this fellow as quietly as possible. Here's the door open. In with you, Mr. Denzil." According to instructions, a policeman had waited behind the closed door, and at the one sharp knock of his superior opened it at once, so that the two slipped in as speedily as possible. Link had a dark lantern, which he used carefully, so that no light could be seen from the window, looking on to the square, and with his 3 companions he went into the back room which had formerly been used by Clear as a sleeping apartment. Here the 2 policemen stationed themselves in one corner, and Link with Lucian waited near the door leading into the sitting room, so as to be ready for Mrs. Clear. All was so dark and lonely and silent that Lucian's nerves became overstrained, and it was as much as he could do to prevent himself from trembling violently. In a whisper he conversed with Link. "Have you heard anything of that girl Rhoda?" he asked. "We have traced her to Berkshire," whispered Link. "She went back to her gypsy kinfolk, you know. I dare say we'll manage to lay hands on her sooner or later. She is an accomplice of Wrent's, I believe." "So do I, and I hope to make him confess as much to-night. Hush!" Suddenly Link had laid his clasp on Lucian's wrist to command silence, and the next moment they heard the swish-swish of a woman's dress coming along the passage. She entered the sitting-room cautiously, moving slowly in the darkness, and stole up to the door behind which Lucian and the detective were hiding. The position of this she knew well, because it was opposite the window. "Are you there?" whispered Mrs. Clear nervously. "Yes," replied Link in the same tone. "Myself, Mr. Denzil, and 2 policemen. Keep the man in talk, and find out, if possible, if he committed the murder." "I hope he won't kill me," muttered Mrs. Clear. "He will if he knows I've betrayed him." "That will be all right," said Link in a low, impatient voice. We will rush out should he prove dangerous. Get over by the window, so that we can see a little of you and Wrent when you talk." "No, no, don't leave the door open. He'll see you." "He won't, Mrs. Clear. We'll keep back in the darkness. If he shows a light, we'll rush him before he can use a weapon or clear out. Get back to the window." "I hope I'll get through with this all right," said Mrs. Clear nervously. "It's an awful situation," and she moved stealthily across the floor to the window. There was a faint gaslight outside, and the watchers could see her figure and profile black against the slight illumination. All was still and silent as the grave when they began their dreary watch. The minutes passed slowly in the darkness, and there was an unbroken silence save for the breathing of the watchers and the restless movements of Mrs. Clear near the window. They saw her pass and repass the square of glass, when unexpectedly she paused, rigid and silent. A stealthy step was ascending the distant stair, and pacing cat-like along the passage. Lucian felt a tremor pass through his body as the steps of the murderer sounded nearer and clearer. They paused at the door, and then moved towards the window where Mrs. Clear was standing. "Is that you?" said a low voice, which came weirdly out of the darkness. "Yes. I've been waiting for the last half hour, Mr. Wrent," replied the woman in nervous tones. "I am glad you have come." "I am glad also," said the voice harshly, "as I wish to know why you propose to betray me." "Because you won't pay me the money," said Mrs. Clear boldly. "And if you don't give it to me this very night, I'll go straight and tell the police all about my husband." "I'll kill you first!" cried the man with a snarl, and made a dash at the woman. With a cry for help she eluded him and sprang towards the bedroom door for protection. The next moment the four watchers were in the room wrestling with Wrent. When he felt the grip of their hands and knew that he was betrayed, he cried out savagely, and fought with the strength of two men. However, he could do little against his four adversaries, and, worn out with the struggle, collapsed suddenly on to the dusty floor with a motion of despair. "Lost! Lost!" he muttered. "All lost!" Breathing hard, Link slipped back the cover of the dark lantern, and turned the light on to the face of the prisoner. Out of the darkness started a pale face with white hair and a long white beard. Lucian uttered a cry. "Mr. Vrain!" he said, shrinking back. "Mr. Vrain!" "Look again," said Link, passing his hand rapidly over the face and head of the prostrate man. Denzil did look, and uttered a second cry more startling than the first. Wig and beard and venerable looks were all gone, and he recognized at once who Wrent was. "Jabez Clyne! Jabez Clyne!" he exclaimed in astonishment. "Yes," said Link triumphantly. "Jabez Clyne, conspirator and assassin!" End of Chapter 30. Recording by Amanda Friday.
Chapter 31 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 31. A Strange Confession. I, Jabez Clyne, write this confession in my prison cell, of my own free will, and without coercion from anyone, partly because I know that the evidence concerning my share in the Vrain conspiracy is strong against me, and partly because I wish to exonerate my daughter Lydia. She is absolutely innocent of all knowledge concerning the feigned death of her husband and his actual existence in a private lunatic asylum. And on the strength of this confession of mine, which will fix the guilt of the matter on the right persons, I demand that she shall be set free. It is not fair that she should suffer, for I and Ferruci planned and carried out the whole conspiracy. Well, Ferruci has punished himself, and soon the law will punish me, so it is only justice that Lydia should be discharged from all blame. On this understanding I set out the whole story of the affair, how it was thought of, how it was contrived, and how it was carried out. Now that Count Ferruci is dead, this confession can harm no one but myself, and may be the means of setting Lydia free. So here I begin my recital. I was always an unlucky man, and the end of my life proves to be as unfortunate as the beginning. I was born in London some 50 and more years ago, in a Whitechapel slum, of drunken and profligate parents, so it is little to be wondered at that my career has been anything but virtuous or respectable. In my early childhood, if it may be called so, I was beaten and starved, set to beg, forced to thieve, and never had a kind word said to me or a kind deed done to me. No wonder I grew up a callous, hardened ruffian. As the twig is bent, so will the tree grow. Out of this depth of degradation I was rescued by a philanthropist who had me fed and clothed and educated. I had at his hands every chance of leading a respectable life, but I did not want to become smug and honest. My early training was too strong for that. So after a year or two of enforced goodness I ran away to sea. The vessel I embarked on as a stowaway was bound for America. When I was discovered hiding among the cargo, we were in mid-ocean, and there was nothing for it but to carry me to the States. Still, to earn my passage, I was made cabin boy to a ruffianly captain, and once more tasted the early delights of childhood, namely, kicks, curses, and starvation. When the ship arrived in New York, I was turned adrift in the city without a penny or a friend. It is not my purpose to describe my sufferings, as such description will do no good and interest nobody, particularly as the purpose of this confession is to declare the Vrain conspiracy and its failure. So I will pass over my early years as speedily as possible. To be brief, I became a newsboy, then a reporter. Afterwards I went West and tried my luck in San Francisco, later on in Texas. But in every case I failed, and became poorer and more desperate than ever. In New Orleans I set up a newspaper, and had a brief time of prosperity, when I married the daughter of a hotel keeper, and for the time was happy. Then the Civil War broke out, and I was ruined. My wife died, leaving me with one child, whom I called Lydia after her. But that child died also, and I was left alone. After the war I prospered again for a time, and married a woman with money. She also died and left a daughter, and this child I again called Lydia, in memory of my first wife, who was the only woman I ever truly loved. I placed little Lydia in a convent for education, and devoted my second wife's money to that purpose. Then I started out for the 5th or 6th time to make my fortune. Needless to say, I did not make it. I pass over a long period of distress and prosperity, hopes and fears. One day I was rich, the next poor, and fate, or whatever malignant deity looked after my poor affairs, knocked me about most cruelly, tossed me up, threw me down, and at the end of a score of years left me comparatively prosperous, with an income in English money of £500 a year. With this I returned to Washington to seek Lydia, and found her grown up into a beautiful and clever girl. Her beauty gave me the idea that I might marry her well in Europe as an American heiress. So for Europe we started, and after many years of travel about the Continent we settled down in the Pension Donizetti in Florence. There Lydia was admired for her beauty and wit, and courted for her money. But save for my £10 a week, which we eked out in the most frugal manner, we had not a penny between us. It was in Florence that we met with Vrain and his daughter, who came to stay at the pension. He was a quiet, harmless old gentleman, a trifle weak in the head, which his daughter said came from overstudy, but which I discovered afterwards was due to habitual indulgence in morphia and other drugs. His daughter watched him closely, and, not having a will of his own by reason of his weak brain, he submitted passively to her guidance. I heard by a side wind that Vrain was rich, and had a splendid mansion in the country, so I hinted to Lydia that, as it seemed difficult to get her a young husband, it would be better for her to marry a rich old one. At that time Lydia was in love with, and almost engaged to, Count Ercole Ferruci, a penniless Italian nobleman, who courted my pretty girl less for her beauty than for her supposed wealth. When I suggested that Lydia should marry Vrain, she refused at first to entertain the idea. But afterwards, seeing that the man was old and weak, she thought it would be a good thing as his wife to inherit his money, and then, as his widow, to marry Ferruci. I think also that the pointed dislike which Diana Vrain manifested for us both, although I'm bound to say she hated Lydia more than she did me, had a great deal to do with my daughter marrying Vrain. However, the end of it was that Lydia broke off her engagement with Ferruci, and very mad he was at losing her, and married Mark Vrain in Florence. After the marriage the old man, who at that time was quite infatuated with Lydia, made a will leaving her his assurance money of £20,000, but the house near Bath and the land he left to Diana. I am bound to say that Lydia behaved very well in this matter, as she could have had all the money and land, but she was content with the assurance money, and did not rob Diana Vrain of her birthright. Yet Diana hated her, and still hates her, but I ask anyone who reads this confession if my dear Lydie is not the better woman of the two. Who dares to say that such a sweet girl is guilty of the crimes she is charged with? Well, the marriage took place, and we all journeyed home to Berwin Manor. But here things went from bad to worse. Old Vrain took again to his morphia, and nothing could restrain him. Then Lydia and Diana fought constantly, and each wished the other out of the house. I tried to keep the peace, and blamed Lydie, who is no saint, I admit, for the way in which she was treating Diana. With Miss Vrain I got on very well, and tried to make things easy for her, but in the end the ill will between her and my Lydia became so strong that Diana left the house and went out to Australia to live with some relatives. So Lydia and I and old Vrain were left alone, and I thought that everything would be right. So it would have been if Lydia had not put matters wrong again by inviting Ferruci over to stay. But she would insist upon doing so, and although I begged and prayed and commanded her not to have so dangerous a man in the house, she held her own, and in the face of my remonstrances and those of her husband, Count Ferruci came to stay with us. From the moment he entered the house there was nothing but trouble. Vrain became jealous, and, mad with drugs he took, often treated Lydia with cruelty and violence, and she came to me for protection. I spoke to Vrain, and he insulted me, wishing to turn me out of the house, but for Lydia's sake I remained. Then a Miss Tyler came to stay, and, falling in love with Count Ferruci, grew jealous of Lydia, and made trouble with Vrain. The end of it was that after a succession of scenes in which the old man behaved like the lunatic he was, he left the house, and not one of us knew where he went to. That was the last Lydia saw of her husband. After that trouble I insisted that Count Ferruci should leave the house, also Miss Tyler. They both did, but came back at times to pay Lydia a visit. We tried to find Vrain, but could not, as he had vanished altogether. Ferruci, I saw, was in love with Lydia, and she with him, but neither the one nor the other hinted at a future marriage should Vrain die. I do not say that Lydia was a fond wife to Vrain, but he treated her so badly that he could not expect her to be, and I dare say I am the one to blame all through, as I made Lydia marry Vrain when she loved Ferruci. But I did it all for the best, so as to get money for my dear girl, and if it has turned out for the worst, my inordinate affection for my child is to blame. All I have done has been for Lydia's sake. All Ferruci did was for Lydia's sake, as he truly loved her. But I swear by all that I hold most holy that Lydia knew not how either of us was working to secure her happiness. Well, Ferruci is dead, and I am in jail, so we have paid in full for our wickedness. I had no idea of getting rid of Vrain until one day Ferruci took me aside and told me that he had found Vrain at Salisbury. He stated that the man was still taking morphia, but in spite of his excesses had so strong a constitution that it appeared he would live for many years. The Count then said that he loved Lydia dearer than life, and wished to marry her if Vrain could be got out of the way. I cried out against murder being done, as I never entertained such an idea for a moment. But Ferruci denied that he wished to harm the man. He wanted him put away in a lunatic asylum, and when I asked him how even then he could marry Lydia, he suggested his scheme of substituting a sickly and dying man for Vrain. The scheme, which was entirely invented by the Count, was as follows. Ferruci said that in a minor London theater he had seen an actor called Clear, who was wonderfully like Vrain, save that he had no scar on the cheek and had a moustache, whereas Vrain was always clean shaved. He had made the acquaintance of the actor, Michael Clear was his full name, and of his wife. They proved to be hard up and mercenary, so Ferruci had no difficulty in gaining over both for his purpose. For a certain sum of money, which was to be paid to Mrs. Clear when her husband was dead, and the Count, married to Lydia, was possessed of the assurance money, Clear agreed to shave off his moustache and personate Vrain. Ferruci, who was something of a chemist, created by means of some acid a scar on Clear's cheek like that on Vrain's, so that he resembled my son-in-law in every way save that he had lost one little finger. Ferruci wanted me to join him in the conspiracy so that I could watch Clear impersonating Vrain, while he himself kept his eye on the real Vrain, who was to be received into Mrs. Clear's house at Bayswater and passed off as her husband. All Mrs. Clear wanted was the money, as, long since wearied of her drunken husband, she did not care if he lived or died. Clear, on his part, knowing that he could not live long, was quite willing to play the part of Vrain on condition that he had plenty to eat and drink, and could live in idleness and luxury. His wishes in this direction cost us a pretty penny, as he bought everything of the best. To this plot I refused consent until I saw how Vrain was, so when Ferruci brought him from Salisbury, where he was hiding, to London, I had an interview with him. He proved to be so stupefied with drugs that he hardly knew me. So, seeing that my Lydia would get no good out of her life by being tied to such a husband, I determined that I would assist Ferruci, on the understanding, of course, that Vrain was to be well looked after in every way. We agreed that when Clear died, and his body was identified as Vrain's, that the real man should be put in an asylum, which was, and I am sure every one will agree with me, the best place for him. All this being arranged, I went out to look for a house in a secluded part of town, in which Clear, under the name of Berwin, should live until he died as Vrain. I did not wish to see about the house in my new character, lest I should be recognized, if there was any trouble over the assurance money. To complicate matters, I determined to disguise myself as the real Vrain. Of course, Clear personated Vrain as Lydia had last seen him, that is, clean-shaven and neat in his dress; but the real Vrain, neglecting his personal appearance, had cultivated a long white beard, and wore a black velvet skull-cap to conceal a baldness which had come upon him. I disguised myself in this fashion, therefore, and went to Pimlico under the name of Wrent. Chapter 32 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 32. The Confession Continued. In Geneva Square, Pimlico, I found the house I wanted. It was number 13, and was said to be haunted, as cries had been heard in it at night, and lights had been seen flitting from window to window when no one was in the house. I looked at it without entering or calling on the landlord, and then I went into Jersey Street to see the back. The house in the same section with it was kept by a Mrs. Bensusan, who took in lodgers. Her rooms were vacant, and as it suited me very well that I should be a neighbor to Clear, I took the rooms. They proved, as I shall explain, better for our purpose than I was aware of. When I told Ferruci of my discovery, he gave Clear money and made him hire the house and furnish 2 rooms for himself. I supplied the money. In this way Clear, calling himself Berwin, which was the name of Vrain's house in the country, came to live in Pimlico. We also removed the real Vrain to Mrs. Clear's at Bayswater, and he passed as her husband. So weak were his brains and so cowed was his spirit that there was no difficulty in keeping him in the house, and the neighbors were told merely that Clear was ill. For my part, I took up my abode in Jersey Street under the name of Wrent, and met Clear outside on occasions when it was necessary for me to see him, but I never entered the house for obvious reasons. I was constantly afraid lest Clear, in his drunken fits, for he was always more or less drunk, should reveal our secret, and I took as my bedroom an apartment in Mrs. Bensusan's, out of the window of which I could overlook the back of number 13. One night, when I was watching, I saw a dark figure glide into Mrs. Bensusan's yard and climb over the fence, only to disappear. I was terribly alarmed, and, wondering what was wrong, I put on my clothes and hurried downstairs into the yard. Also I climbed over the fence into the yard of number 13. Here I could not see where the figure had disappeared to, as the doors and windows at the back of the house were all locked. I could not conjecture who the woman was, for it was a woman, I saw, who had entered, or why she had done so, or in what way she had gained admission. While I was thus thinking, I saw the woman again. She apparently rose out of the earth, and after closing what appeared to be a trap door, she made for the fence. I stopped her before she got there, and found to my surprise that she was a red-headed servant of Mrs. Bensusan's, a kind of gypsy, very clever and, I think, with much evil in her. She was alarmed at being discovered, and begged me not to tell on her. For my own sake I promised not to do so, but made her explain how she got into the house and why she entered it. Then she told me an extraordinary tale. For some years, she said, she had been with Mrs. Bensusan, who had taken her from the gypsies to civilize her. And hating the restraint of civilized life, she had been in the habit of roaming about at night. Knowing that the house at the back was unoccupied, this Rhoda, for that is her name, climbed over the fence and tried to get into it, but found the doors and windows bolted and barred. Then one night she saw a kind of grated window amid the grass, and as this proved not to be bolted, she pulled it open. Taking a candle with her, she went on a voyage of discovery, and dropped through this hole some distance into a disused cellar. Only a cat could have got in safely, for the height was considerable, and indeed Rhoda did not risk that mode of entrance again, for finding a ladder in the cellar, which I presume had been used to get at the higher bins of wine, she placed this against the aperture, and thus was able to ascend and descend without difficulty. Frequently by this means she entered the empty house, and went from room to room with her candle, singing gypsy songs as she wandered. So here I had found the ghost of number 13, although I don't suppose this impish gypsy girl knew as much. She haunted the house just to amuse herself, when fat Mrs. Bensusan thought she was safe in bed. I asked Rhoda why she had entered the house on that particular night when I had caught her. She confessed that she had seen some articles of silver in Clear's rooms which she wished to steal, but on this occasion he had locked the door, a thing which he did not always do in his drunken humours, and so Rhoda was returning disappointed. After this confession I made her go back to her own house and promised to keep her secret. I also told her that if she held her tongue I would give her a present. For this purpose I made Ferruci buy me a cloak lined with rabbit skins, as Rhoda on her night excursions wanted something to keep her warm. When Ferruci gave it to me, and it was lying in my room, Mrs. Clear came one night to see me, and finding it cold, she borrowed the cloak to wrap around her. She kept it for some time, and brought it back on Christmas Eve, when I gave it next day to Rhoda. It was Ferruci who bought the cloak, not I, and it was purchased for Rhoda, not for Mrs. Clear. The next night I entered number 13 by the cellar way, and found it of great advantage, as I could visit Clear without exciting suspicion, and so keep an eye on him. At first he was alarmed by my unexpected appearance, but when I showed him the secret way he made use of it also. We used it only on dark nights, and it was for this reason that we were not noticed by the neighbors. It would never have done for any of us to be seen climbing over the fence. Mrs. Clear once visited her husband and had a quarrel with him about his drinking. It was her shadow and Clear's which Denzil saw on the blind. As soon as they heard his ring they both went out the back way, and in climbing hurriedly over the fence Mrs. Clear tore her veil. It was a portion of this which Denzil found. On that night Clear, after leaving his wife, entered the square by the front, and so met with Denzil, much to the latter's surprise. I was very angry when Clear showed Denzil over the house, but he said that the young man was very suspicious, and he only showed him the house to prove that there was no one in it, and that he must have been mistaken about the shadows on the blind. Notwithstanding this explanation, I did not approve of Clear's act, nor, indeed, of his acquaintance with Denzil. For some months matters went on this way. Clear remained in the silent house, drinking himself to death. Mrs. Clear looked after Vrain in her Bayswater house, and I, in my old man disguise, remained in Jersey Street, although at times I left there and went to see my daughter. All this time Lydia had no idea of what we were preparing. Then I began to grow wearied of the position, for Clear proved tougher than we anticipated, and showed no signs of dying. In despair, I thought I would give him the means to kill himself. Mind, I did not wish to murder him myself, but the man, when in his drinking fits, thought he was attacked by enemies, and when in a melancholic frame of mind, on recovery, would frequently hint at suicide. I therefore thought that if a weapon were left within his reach he might kill himself. I don't defend my conduct in this case, but surely this drunken scoundrel was better dead than alive. In choosing a weapon, I wished to select one that would implicate Ferruci rather than myself, in case there was any trouble over the matter. So I chose for my purpose a stiletto which hung by a parti-colored ribbon on the walls of the library at Berwin Manor. I fancied that the stiletto, having been bought in Florence, and Ferruci coming from Florence, he, if any one, should any of these facts come to life, would be credited with giving it to Clear. I took the stiletto from Berwin Manor some time before Christmas, and bringing it up to town, I left it, on the day before Christmas, on the table in Clear's sitting-room. That was at 9 o'clock in the night, and that was when I last saw him alive. Who killed him, I know no more than anyone else. On Christmas Eve I was ill, and wrote to Lydia to come up. She met me at the Pagalls', but as I felt ill I left there at 6 o'clock, and Lydia stayed with the family all night. At 7 o'clock Mrs. Clear came to me with Ferruci, and brought back the cloak which I gave afterwards to Rhoda. She wanted to see her husband again, but I refused to let her risk the visit. Ferruci came to tell me that he was arranging to place Vrain, who was becoming too violent to be restrained, in the private asylum of Dr. Jorce at Hampstead. Mrs. Clear was to go with him, and we conversed about the matter. Ferruci went away first, as he desired to see Clear, and for that purpose waited about until it was darker, and went into the back yard shortly after 8 o'clock. There he was seen by Rhoda as he was about to climb the fence, and not knowing it was the girl, he took fright and ran out of the yard into Jersey Street. Here he found Mrs. Clear, who had left me and was waiting for him, and the pair went off to see Dr. Jorce at Hampstead. I believe they remained there all night. Left alone, I climbed over the fence about 9 o'clock and saw Clear. He was celebrating Christmas Eve by drinking heavily, and I was unable to bring him to reason. I therefore left the stiletto which I had brought with me on the table, and returned to my house in Jersey Street. I never saw him alive again. I went to bed and slept all night, so I was aware of nothing in connection with the death until late on Christmas Day. Then Mrs. Bensusan was told by Miss Greeb, the landlady of Denzil, that the tenant of number 13 had been murdered. I fancied that he had killed himself in a fit of melancholia with the stiletto I had left on his table, but I did not dare to go near the house to find this out. Afterwards I learned that the doctor who examined the body was of the opinion that Clear had been murdered, and being afraid about the police taking up the case, I paid Mrs. Bensusan a week's rent and left her house 2 days after Christmas. I returned to Berwin Manor, and shortly afterwards Ferruci joined me there, as he had successfully incarcerated Vrain in the asylum under the name of Michael Clear. When the advertisement came out, it was I who hinted to Lydia that the dead man, seeing that he called himself Berwin, might be her husband. We went up to town. Lydia identified the body of Clear as her husband in all innocence, for after death the man looked more like Vrain than ever, and in due time the assurance money was obtained. I do not think there is anything more to tell, save that I did not know that Mrs. Clear had betrayed me. I could not pay her the money, as I could not get it from Lydia. I told Lydia I was going to Paris, but in reality I was hunting for Rhoda, who had run away from Jersey Street. I fancied she might betray us, and wished to make things safe with her. Before I found her, however, I saw in the papers that Ferruci had committed suicide; also that Lydia, who had gone to Dover to meet me, thinking I was returning from Paris, had been arrested. Then I saw Mrs. Clear's advertisement, saying she would betray me if I did not pay the money. I consented to meet her in order to implore her silence, and so fell into the clutches of the law. I may state that I did not kill Clear, as I never saw him after 9 o'clock, and then he was alive. In spite of what the doctor said, I am still inclined to think he killed himself. Now I have made a clean breast of it, I am willing to be punished, but I hope Lydia will be set free, for whosoever is guilty, she is innocent. I have been an unlucky man, and I remain one at this moment when I sign myself for the last time, Jabez Clyne. Needless to say, both Link and Denzil were greatly surprised at this confession, which revealed all things save the one they wished to know. "What do you think of this idea of suicide?" asked Lucian. "It is quite out of the question," replied the detective decidedly. "The doctor who examined the body said that it was impossible the man could have committed suicide. The position of the wound shows that. Also the power of the stroke. No man could drive a stiletto so dexterously and strongly into the heart. Also the room was in confusion, which points to a struggle, and the stiletto is missing. It was not suicide, but murder, and I believe either Clyne or Ferruci killed the man." "But Ferruci was not—" "He was not there after 10," interrupted Link, "but he was there about 8. I dare say when Rhoda saw him he was coming back after having committed the deed, and Clyne says the stiletto was not there at the time, just to screen him." "It is of little use to screen the dead," said Lucian. "I think only one person can tell the truth about this murder, and that is Rhoda. I am looking for her, Mr. Denzil." This was easy saying, but harder doing, for weeks passed away, and in spite of all the efforts of the police, Rhoda could not be found. Then one morning the detective, much excited, burst into Lucian's rooms, waving a paper over his head. "A confession!" he cried. "Another confession!" "Of whom?" asked Lucian, surprised. "Of Rhoda," replied Link excitedly. "She has confessed. It was Rhoda who killed Michael Clear." End of Chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of The Silent House. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amanda Friday. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 33. What Rhoda Had to Say. Of all the news concerning the truth of Clear's death, this was the last which Lucian expected to hear. He stood staring at the excited face of the detective in wide-eyed surprise, and for the moment could not find his voice. "It is true, I tell you!" cried Link, sitting down and smoothing out the paper which he carried. "Rhoda, and none other, killed the man." "Are you sure, Link?" "Of course I am. This," flourishing the paper, "is her dying confession." "Her dying confession?" repeated the barrister blankly. "Is she dead also?" "Yes. It is a long story, Mr. Denzil. Sit down and I'll tell it to you. As you have had so much to do with the beginning of the case, it is only fair that you should know the end, and a strange end it is." Without a word Lucian sat down, feeling quite confused, for in no way could he guess how Clear had come by his death at the hands of Rhoda. He had suspected Lydia as guilty of the crime, he had credited Ferruci with its commission, and he had been certain of the guilt of Clyne, alias Wrent, but to discover that the red-headed servant was the culprit entirely bewildered him. She had no motive to kill the man, she had given evidence freely in the matter, and in all respects had acted as an innocent person. So this was why she had left Jersey Street? It was a fear of being arrested for the crime which had driven her into the wilds. But as Lucian privately thought, she need not have fled, for as far as he could see, beyond the startling announcement of Link, there was no evidence to connect her with the matter. It was most extraordinary. "I see you are astonished," said Link with a nod. "So was I. Of all folk I least suspected that imp of a girl. The truth would never have been known had she not confessed at the last moment, for even now I cannot see, on the face of it, any evidence, save her own confession, to inculpate her in the matter. So you see, Mr. Denzil, the mystery of this man's death, which we've been so anxious to solve, has not yet been explained by you, or discovered by me, but has been brought to light by chance, which, after all, is the great detective." "You may well look astonished," repeated the man slowly. "I am. Immensely." "Let me hear the confession, Link." "Wait one moment. I'll tell you how it came to be made, and then I'll relate the story in my own fashion, as the way in which the confession is written is too muddled for you to understand clearly. Still, it shows plainly enough that Clyne, for all our suspicions, is innocent." "And Rhoda, the sharp servant girl, guilty," said Lucian reflectively. "I never should have thought that she was involved in the matter. How the deuce did she come to confess?" "Well," said Link, clearing his throat as a preliminary to his narrative, "it seems that Mr. Bensusan, in a fit of philanthropy, picked up this wretched girl in the country. She belonged to some gypsies, but as her parents were dead, and the child a burden, the tribe were glad to get rid of her. Rhoda Stanley, that is her full name, was taken to London by Mrs. Bensusan, who tried to civilize her." "I don't think she succeeded very well, Link. Rhoda, with her cunning ways and roaming about at night, was always a savage at heart. In spite of what Clyne says in his confession, I believe she took a delight in turning number 13 into a haunted house with her shrieking and her flitting candles. How she must have enjoyed herself when she heard the talk about the ghost!" "I have no doubt she did, Mr. Denzil, but even those delights wearied her, and she longed to get back to the free gypsy life. When she found, through you, sir, that the police wanted to know too much about Clear's death, she left Mrs. Bensusan in the lurch, and tramped off down to the New Forest, where she picked up again with her tribe." "How did her mistress take her desertion?" "Very much to heart, as she had treated the young savage very kindly, and ought to have received more gratitude. Perhaps when she hears how her adopted child wandered about at night, and ended by killing Clear, she will be glad she's dead and buried. Yet, I don't know. Women are wonderfully soft-hearted, and certainly Rhoda's thought no end of by that fat woman." "Well, well," said Lucian, impatient of this digression. "So Rhoda went back to her tribe?" "Yes, sir. And as she was sharp, clever, and, moreover, came with some money which she had stolen from Mrs. Bensusan, for she added theft to ingratitude, she was received with open arms. With her gypsy cousin she went about in the true gypsy style, but, not being hardened to the outdoor life in wet weather, she fell ill." "Civilization made her delicate, I suppose," said Denzil grimly. "Exactly. She was not fit for the tent life after having lived for so long under a comfortable roof. She fell ill with inflammation of the lungs, and in a wonderfully short space of time she died." "When did she confess her crime?" "I'm coming to that, sir. When she was dying she sent 2 gypsies to the nearest magistrate, who happened to be the vicar of the parish in which the tribe were then encamped, and asked him to see her on a matter of life and death. The vicar came at once, and when he became aware that Rhoda was the girl wanted in the Vrain case, for he'd read all about her in the papers, he became very interested. He took down the confession of the wretched girl, had it signed by 2 witnesses and Rhoda herself, and sent it up to Scotland Yard." "And this confession—" "Here it is," said Link, pointing to the manuscript on the table. "But it's too long to read, so I shall just tell you briefly what Rhoda confessed and how she committed the crime." "Go on, I am most anxious to hear, Link." "Well, Mr. Denzil, you know that Rhoda was in the habit of visiting number 13 by night, and amusing herself by wandering about the empty rooms, although I don't know what pleasure she found in doing so. It seems that when Clear became the tenant of the house, Rhoda was very angry, as his presence interfered with her midnight capers. However, on seeing his rooms, for Clear found her one night and took her in to show them to her, she was filled with admiration and with true gipsy instinct wanted to steal some of the ornaments. She tried to pocket a silver paper knife on that very night Clear was so hospitable to her, but she was not sharp enough, and the man saw the theft. In a rage at her dishonesty he turned her out of the room and swore that he would thrash her if she came into his presence again." "Did the threat keep Rhoda away?" "Not it. I am sure you saw enough of that wild cat to know nothing would frighten her. She certainly did not thrust herself personally on Clear, but whenever his back was turned she took to stealing things out of his room, when he was foolish enough to leave the door open. Clear was much enraged and complained to Clyne, known to Rhoda as Wrent, who in his turn read the girl a sharp lecture. But having shown Clyne the cellar way into the house, Miss Rhoda knew too much, and laughed in Clyne's face. He did not dare to make her thefts public, or complain to Mrs. Bensusan, lest Rhoda should tell of the connection between him and the tenant of the Silent House, who passed under the name of Berwin. Therefore he told Clear to keep his sitting-room door locked. "A wise precaution with that imp about," said Lucian. "I hope Clear was sensible enough to adopt it." "Yes, and no. When he was sober he locked the door, and when drunk he left it open, and Rhoda looted at will. Now comes the more important part of the confession. You remember that Clyne left the stiletto from Berwin Manor on Clear's table?" "Yes, with the amiable intention that the poor devil should kill himself. He left it on Christmas Eve, too. A pleasant time for a man to commit suicide." "Of course, the intention was horrible," said Mr. Link gravely. "Some people might think such an act incredible, but I have seen so much of the worst side of human nature that I am not surprised. Clyne was too cowardly to kill the man himself, so he thought to make Clear his own executioner by leaving the stiletto in his way. Well, sir, the weapon proved to be useful in the way it was intended by Clyne, for Clear was killed with that very weapon." "And by Rhoda," said Lucian, nodding. "I see. How did she get hold of it?" "By accident. When Clyne, and Mrs. Bensusan went to bed on Christmas Eve, Rhoda thought she would have some of her devil dances in the haunted house, so she slipped out of bed and into the yard, and dropped down into the cellar, whence she went up to Clear's rooms." "Was Clear in bed?" "No, but he was in his bedroom, and according to Rhoda furiously drunk. You know that Clyne said the man had been drinking all day. On this night he had left his sitting-room door open and the lamp burning. On the table was the silver-handled stiletto, with the ribbon, and when Rhoda peered into the room to see what she could pick up, she thought she would like this pretty toy. She stole forward softly and took the stiletto, but before she could get back to the door, Clear, who had been watching her, reeled out and rushed at her." "Did she run away?" "She couldn't. Clear was between her and the door. She ran round the room, upsetting everything, for she thought he would kill her in his drunken rage. Don't you remember, Mr. Denzil, how disorderly the room was? Well, Clear got Rhoda into a corner, and was going to strike her. She had the stiletto still in her hand, and held it point outward to save herself from the blow. She thought when he saw the weapon he would not dare to come nearer. However, either he did not see the stiletto, or was too drunk to feel fear, for he stumbled and fell forward so that the dagger ran right into his heart. In a moment he fell dead, before he had time, as Rhoda says, to even utter a cry." "So it was an accident, after all," said Lucian. "Oh yes, quite an accident," replied Link, "and I can see very plainly how it took place. Of course Rhoda was terrified at what she'd done, although she really was not to blame, and leaving the dead man, ran away with the stiletto. She dropped the ribbon off it near the cellar door as she was running away, and there Mrs. Kebby found it." "What did she do with the stiletto?" "She had it in her room, and when she left Mrs. Bensusan she carried it with her down the country. In proof of the truth, she gave it to the vicar who wrote down her confession, and he sent it up with the papers to Scotland Yard. Queer case, isn't it?" "Very queer, Link. I thought everybody was guilty but Rhoda." "Ah," said the detective significantly, "it is always the least suspected person who is guilty. I could have sworn that Clyne was the man. Now it seems that he is innocent, so instead of hanging he will only be imprisoned for his share in the conspiracy." "He may escape that way," said Lucian dryly, "but morally speaking, I regard him as more guilty than Rhoda." End of Chapter 33. Recording by Amanda Friday. Chapter 34 of The Silent House by Fergus Hume. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Hannah. The Silent House by Fergus Hume. Chapter 34. The End of It All. 2 years after the discovery of Rhoda's guilt, Mr. and Mrs. Denzil were seated in the garden of Berwin Manor. It was a perfect summer evening at the sunset hour, something like that evening when, in the same garden, almost at the same time, Lucian had asked Diana to be his wife. But between then and now 24 months had elapsed, and many things had taken place of more or less importance to the young couple. The mystery of Clear's death had been solved. Lydia had been set free as innocent of crime. Her father, found guilty of conspiracy to obtain the assurance money, had been condemned to a long term of imprisonment, and what most concerned Lucian and Diana, Mark Vrain had really and truly gone the way of all flesh. After the conclusion of the Vrain case, Lucian had become formally engaged to Diana, but it was agreed between them that the marriage should not take place for some time on account of her father's health. After his discharge as cured from the asylum of Dr. Jorce, Miss Vrain had taken her father down to his own place in the country, and there tended him with the most affectionate solicitude, in the hope that he would recover his health. But the hope was vain, for by his overindulgence in morphia, his worrying and wandering, and irregular mode of life, Vrain had completely shattered his health. He lapsed into a state of second childhood, and being deprived of the drugs which formerly had excited him to a state of frenzy, sank into a pitiable condition. For days he would remain without speaking to anyone, and even ceased to take a pleasure in his books. Finally his limbs became paralyzed, and so he spent the last few months of his wretched life in a bath chair being wheeled round the garden. Still, his constitution was so strong that he lived for quite 12 months after his return to his home, and died unexpectedly in his sleep. Diana was not sorry when he passed so easily away, for death was a merciful release of his tortured soul from his worn-out body. So Mark Vrain died and was buried, and after the funeral Diana went abroad with Miss Priscilla Barbar for a companion. In the meantime Lucian stayed in grimy, smoky London and worked hard at his profession. He was beginning to be known, and in time actually received a brief or two, with which he did his best in court. Still, he was far from being the successful pleader he hoped to be, for law, of all professions, is one which demands time and industry for the attainment of any degree of excellence. It is rarely that a young lawyer can go to sleep and wake to find himself famous. He must crawl rather than run. With diligence and punctuality, and observance of every chance, in time the wished-for goal is reached, although that goal, in 9 cases out of 10, is a very moderate distance off. Lucian did not sigh for a judgeship, or for a seat on the woolsack. He was content to be a barrister with a good practice, and perhaps a Q.C.ship in prospect. However, during the year of Diana's mourning, he did so well that he felt justified in asking her to marry him when she returned. Diana, on her side, saw no obstacle to this course, so she consented. "If you are not rich, my dear, I am," she said, when Lucian alleged his poverty as the only bar to their union. "And as money gives me no pleasure without you, I do not care to stay in Berwin Manor in lonely spinsterhood. I shall marry you whenever you choose." And Lucian, taking advantage of this gracious permission, did choose to be married, and that speedily. So within 2 years after the final closing of the Vrain case, they became man and wife. At the time they were seated in the garden, at the hour of sunset, they had only lately returned from their honeymoon, and were now talking over past experiences. Miss Priscilla, who had been left in charge of the manor during their absence, had welcomed them back with much joy, as she looked upon the match as one of her own making. Now she had gone inside on the understanding that the 2 are company and 3 are none, and the young couple were left alone. Hand in hand, after the foolish fashion of lovers, they sat under a leafy oak tree, and the sunlight glowed readily on their happy faces.
After a short silence, Lucian looked at the face of his wife and laughed. "What is amusing you, dear?" said Mrs. Denzil with a sympathetic smile. "My thoughts were rather pleasant than amusing," replied Lucian, giving the hand that lay in his a squeeze. "But I was thinking of Hans Andersen's tale of the elder mother tree, and of the old couple who sat enjoying their golden wedding under the linden, with the red sunlight shining on their silver crowns." "We are under an oak, and wear no crowns," replied Diana in her turn, "but we are quite happy, I think, although it is not our golden wedding." "Perhaps that will come some day, Diana." 50 years, my dear, is a long way off yet," says Mrs. Denzil dubiously. "I am glad it is, for I shall have 50 years of happiness with you to look forward to. Upon my word, Diana, I think you deserve happiness, after all the trouble you have had." "With you I am sure to be happy, Lucian. But other people, poor souls, are not so well off." "What other people?" "Jabez Clyne, for one." "My dear," said Lucian seriously, "I hope I am not a hard man, but I really cannot find it in my heart to pity Clyne. He was, and I dare say is, a scoundrel." "I don't deny that he acted badly," sighed Diana, "but it was for his daughter's sake, you know." "There is a limit even to paternal affection, Diana, and putting aside the wickedness of the whole conspiracy, I cannot pardon a man who deliberately put a weapon in the way of a man almost insane with drink, in order that he might kill himself. The idea was diabolically wicked, my dear, and I think that Jabez Clyne, alias Rent, quite deserves the long imprisonment he received." "At all events, the serious company got back their money, Lucian." "So much as Lydia had not spent they got back, Diana. But when your father actually died, they had to part with it very soon again, and some of it has gone into Lydia's pocket after all." Diana blushed. "It was only right, dear," she said apologetically. "When my father made his new will, leaving it all to me, I did not think that Lydia, however badly she treated him, should be left absolutely penniless." "And you know, Lucian, you agreed that I should share the assurance money with her." "I did," replied Denzil. "Of two evils I choose the least, for if Lydia had not got a portion of the money she would have been quite capable of trying to upset the second will on the ground that Mr. Vrain was insane." "Papa was not insane," reproved Diana. "He was weak, I admit, but at the time he made that will he had all his senses. Besides, after all the scandal of the case, I don't think Lydia would have dared to go to law about it. Still, it was best to give her the money, and I hear from Miss Priscilla that Lydia is now in Italy and proposes to marry an Italian prince." "She has flown higher than a count, then. Poor Ferrucci killed himself for her sake." "For his own, rather," exclaimed Mrs. Denzil energetically. "He knew that if he lived he would be punished by imprisonment, so chose to kill himself rather than suffer such dishonour. I believe he truly loved Lydia, certainly, but as he wanted the assurance money, I fancy he sinned quite as much for his own sake as for Lydia's." "No doubt, and I dare say Lydia loved him, after her own fashion. Yet she seems to have forgotten him pretty soon, and, as you say, intends to marry a prince. I don't envy his highness." "She has no heart, so I dare say she will be happy as such women ever are," said Diana contemptuously. "Yet her happiness comes out of much evil. If she had not married my father, her own would not now be in prison, nor would Count Ferrucci and Rhoda be dead." "Ferrucci, perhaps, might still be alive, and her husband," assented Lucian. "But I have my doubts about Rhoda. She was a wicked, precocious little imp, that girl, and sooner or later would have come to a bad end. The death of Clear was due to an accident, I admit, but Rhoda has still one person who laments over her. For, although Mrs. Bensusan knows the truth, she always thinks of that red-haired minx as a kind of martyr, who was led into wicked ways by Clyne, alias Rent. I am sure Mrs. Clear doesn't think so. Mrs. Clear has got quite enough to think about in remembering how narrowly she escaped imprisonment for her share in that shameful conspiracy. If she had not turned Queen's evidence, she would have been punished as Clyne was. As it is, she just escaped by an accident. Still, if it had not been for her, we would never have discovered the truth. I would never have suspected Clyne, who was always so meek and mild. Even that visit he paid to me to lament over his daughter's probable marriage to Ferrucci was a trick to find out how much I knew." Don't you think he hated Ferrucci? No, I'm sure he did not. He acted a part to find out what I was doing. If Mrs. Clear had not betrayed him, we should never have discovered the conspiracy. And if Rhoda had not spoken, the mystery of Clear's death would never have been solved, said Diana, although she only confessed at the 11th hour and when she was dying. I think Link was pleased that the mystery was solved in so unexpected a way, said Lucian, laughing. He never forgave my finding out so much without his aid. He ascribes the ending of the whole matter to chance, and I dare say he is right. Said Mrs. Stenzel, who had no great love for the detective. He certainly left everything to chance. Twice he gave up the case. And twice I gave it up, said Denzil. If it had not been for you, dear, I should never have gone on with what seemed to be a hopeless task. But when I first met you, you induced me to continue the search for the culprit. And again, when by the evidence of the missing finger, you did not believe your father was dead. Well, you worked, I worked, Link worked, said Diana philosophically, and we all three did our best to discover the truth, only to let chance discover it in the long run. Diana laughed and nodded, but did not contradict her husband. Well, my dear, she said, I think we have discussed the subject pretty freely, but there is one thing I should like to know. What about the silent house in Pimlico? Oh, Miss Greeb told me the other day that Peacock is going to pull it down. You know, just before we were married, I took leave of Miss Greeb, with whom I lodged for a long time. Well, she gave me a piece of news. She is going to be married also, and to whom do you think? I don't know, said Diana, looking interested, as women always do in marriage news. To Peacock, who owns nearly all the property in and about Geneva Square. It will be a splendid match for her, and Mrs. Peacock will be much richer than you or I, Diana. But not happier, my dear. I am glad she is to be married, as she seemed a nice woman, and made you very comfortable. But why is the silent house to be pulled down? Because no one will live in it. But it is not haunted now. You know it was discovered that Rhoda was the ghost, and the ghost, as Miss Greeb suggested, killed Clear. It is haunted now by the ghost of Clear, said Lucian gravely. At all events, he was murdered there, and no one cares to live in the house. I confess I shouldn't care to live in it myself. So, Peacock, finding the house unprofitable, has determined to pull it down. So there is an end to the silent house of Pimlico, said Diana, rising and taking her husband's arm. Come inside, Lucian, it grows chilly. Though winds be cold and nights be drear, yet love makes warm our hearts, my dear, quoted Lucian as they went up to the house. That is not very good poetry, but it is a beautiful truth, my love. Diana laughed and looked up proudly into the bright face of her husband. So they went inside and found that Miss Priscilla had made the tea, and all were very happy, and very thankful for their happiness. In this condition, which is sufficiently pleasant, I think we may leave them. End of chapter 34 of The Silent House. Recording by Ashley Hannah. End of The Silent House by Fergus Hume.